It began with a village that seemed too small to matter and too quiet to be dangerous. Foy sat on a slight rise in the Ardennes, its stone houses clustered together as if bracing against the winter wind. Snow lay thick across rooftops and fields, softening the sharp edges of war from a distance, disguising craters, shell fragments, and frozen blood beneath a blanket of white. Smoke drifted lazily from shattered chimneys, rising into a sky that never quite brightened beyond grey. But Foy was not quiet. It was waiting, just beyond the village, in the dark tree line of the Bois Jacques. American paratroopers huddled in frozen foxholes. They had survived the encirclement at Bastogne. They had endured artillery that fell day and night without mercy. They had watched friends disappear beneath snow and smoke. Their uniforms were stiff with ice. Their boots were soaked through. Their hands trembled not from fear anymore, but from cold that never loosened its grip. And still, the war was not finished with them. Foy mattered because it sat on high ground, because its buildings offered cover, because its roads connected artillery positions, because whoever held it could see, could strike, could control the frozen landscape around Bastogne. The Germans knew this, and so did the Americans. The first assaults toward Foy were cautious, uncertain, shaped by exhaustion as much as by strategy. Paratroopers moved forward through snow that reached their knees, every step a quiet struggle. Their breath came out in white clouds that gave away positions. Rifles felt heavier with every yard. Machine guns were dragged forward with hands numb and raw. The village loomed ahead, silent, its windows dark, its walls scarred from earlier fighting. Then the silence shattered. German defenders had transformed Foy into a fortress of winter. Machine guns waited behind stone walls. Snipers watched from upper floors, patient and still. Mortars dropped shells that burst into snow and wood and screaming fragments. Each house became a strong point. Each doorway became a question with only violent answers. The Americans were forced back, not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not overcome cold steel, entrenched positions, and bodies already pushed past endurance. The retreat left its own scars, snow churned by boots, equipment abandoned, wounded men carried back through open fields under fire. The forest swallowed them again, leaving Foy standing, defiant and dangerous. Inside the trees, frustration grew heavy. So did anger. So did resolve. The men of the 101st Airborne had not come this far to stop at a frozen village. When the next attack came, it came with everything they had left. Artillery thundered across the fields, shells slamming into Foy with echoes that rolled through the valley. Buildings shuddered, roofs collapsed, smoke poured into the winter air, mixing with falling snow until the village blurred into a grey smear of destruction. Infantry moved behind the barrage, rifles clutched tight, hearts pounding louder than the gunfire. They crossed open ground, knowing exactly what waited for them. Bullets snapped through the air. Men fell. Others pressed on without looking back. Snow turned dark where bodies hit the ground. The fight inside Foy was brutal and intimate. Room to room, stairwell to stairwell, grenades tossed into shadows, rifles fired until barrels steamed in the cold. Shouts echoed off stone walls. Boots slipped on frozen floors, slick with debris. German defenders fought hard, refusing to yield ground inch by inch. But they were running out of space, out of ammunition, out of options. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began to take the village. One house fell, then another. Machine gun nests were silenced. Snipers were flushed from upper windows. The sound of fighting moved deeper into Foy until it reached the far edge, where resistance finally broke under the weight of exhaustion and overwhelming pressure. When the last shots faded, the village stood in ruins. Snow settled again, drifting quietly over shattered walls and broken furniture. The air smelled of smoke and cordite. Men leaned against whatever still stood, breathing hard, hands shaking, faces streaked with grime and ice. Foy had been taken, but at a cost that lingered in every silent moment afterward. The Battle of Foy was not large on maps. It was not swift. It was not glorious in the way history sometimes prefers, but it mattered. It mattered because it showed what endurance really looks like, because it revealed the price of holding ground in winter war, because it proved that even after surviving hell, soldiers could still be asked to walk back into it. Tonight, we return to that frozen village, to the snow-covered fields between forest and stone, to the men who stepped forward when their bodies begged them not to the quiet after the gunfire, when victory felt heavy instead of triumphant. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something gentle, something grounded in this moment. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour rests quietly around you? Is it late where you are, wrapped in stillness, or does the night feel alive? And something deeper unique to this episode, the Battle of Foy reminds us that sometimes the hardest fights come after we think we have already survived the worst. In your own life, has there been a moment when you had to find strength again after believing you were already empty? If you feel comfortable, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, steady journeys into the past help your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. December 28th, 1944, a paratrooper named Edward Heffron pressed his body deeper into the frozen Belgian earth, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes as he stared across 2 miles of winter landscape toward a small village called Foy. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, with wind chill. His foxhole, carved into ground so frozen it had taken 3 men 2 hours to dig, offered no real shelter from the cold that crept through wool and canvas like water through cloth. Around him, 63 other men from Easy Company huddled in similar holes, their breath creating small clouds that hung in the still air like signals to enemy observers. They had been here, outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, for 23 days without relief, and every man knew that rest was not coming. The village of Foy sat on slightly elevated ground to the north, its church steeple rising above modest stone houses and barns that had stood for generations. Through the morning mist, it looked almost peaceful, a typical Ardennes farming community that might hold 250 souls in better times. But Captain Richard Winters, walking the line of foxholes that morning, knew better. German artillery spotters occupied that church steeple, directing fire with methodical precision onto American positions. Every truck that tried to move supplies forward, every cluster of men gathering for warmth, became a target within minutes. The village wasn't peaceful at all. It was a weapon aimed directly at them. Easy Company had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day with 140 men. They had fought through hedgerows, liberated French villages, jumped into Holland for Operation Market Garden, and somehow survived when their aircraft took anti-aircraft fire that should have killed them all. Now, after the desperate siege of Bastogne, where they had been surrounded by German forces for 7 days, only 64 remained fit for combat. The siege had officially ended on December 26th, when General Patton's armour broke through from the south, but the fighting had not stopped. The Germans still held strong positions to the north and east, and until those positions fell, there would be no rest, no rotation off the line, no warm meals or clean socks or sleep in buildings with roofs. The Bastogne siege had become famous even as it was happening. Newspapers back home had carried stories of the surrounded paratroopers who refused to surrender, of General McAuliffe's one-word reply to German surrender demands. Nuts. But what the newspapers didn't capture was the grinding exhaustion that came after, when relief arrived but orders remained. Easy Company's men had not slept in beds since early December. They had not removed their boots in weeks. Trench foot was epidemic, turning feet purple and swollen inside frozen leather. They ate 1 K ration per day, sometimes less when supply trucks couldn't get through. At night, they took turns staying awake in 2-man shifts, watching the darkness for German patrols that probed their lines with cruel regularity. Private First Class Edward Heffron, who everyone called Babe, had grown up in South Philadelphia, where winters meant snow you could play in, cold that drove you inside to radiators and hot soup. This Belgian winter was different. It was a cold that didn't just chill, it killed. Men lost fingers to frostbite while sleeping, weapons froze and refused to fire. The oil in their M1 Garand rifles became so thick in the cold that bolts moved sluggishly or jammed entirely. The ground was frozen so hard that when artillery shells landed, they didn't bury themselves before exploding. Instead, they burst on the surface, sending shrapnel in all directions with lethal efficiency. This was winter's enemy, as indiscriminate as any German machine gun. From his foxhole, Heffron could see the church steeple in Foy clearly. Sometimes, when the light was right, he could see the glint of binoculars up there, German observers watching them. It created a strange psychological weight, knowing you were being watched by men who wanted you dead, men who were calling in coordinates for artillery batteries 3 kilometers away. A wounded paratrooper named Jackson, hit 2 days earlier by shrapnel from Foy-directed fire, had asked Winters the question everyone was thinking, "When do we get pulled off the line, sir?" Winters had looked at him with exhausted eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They all knew the answer. They would be pulled off the line when Foy was taken, and not before. The strategic situation made brutal sense, even if it felt unbearable to the men living it. Bastogne sat at a critical road junction, 7 roads radiating out like spokes on a wheel. The Germans had surrounded it precisely because controlling those roads meant controlling movement through the Ardennes. Now that the siege was broken, those same roads needed to carry American supplies and reinforcements forward to press the counterattack. But as long as German observers sat in Foy's church steeple with clear views of the southern approaches, every vehicle moving north was a target. 12 to 15 American soldiers were being killed or wounded each day from artillery fire directed from that village. The mathematics were simple and savage. Foy had to be taken, and Easy Company was going to take it. Sergeant William Guarnier, a tough paratrooper from South Philadelphia like Heffron, moved between foxholes that morning checking on his men. Guarnier had been wounded at Bastogne, evacuated, and then gone AWOL from the hospital to return to his company because, as he told anyone who asked, his men needed him. He had a way of making dark jokes that somehow made the situation more bearable. "Hey, look at it this way," he told one shivering soldier. "At least we ain't bored." But beneath the humour, everyone could see the strain. These were men who had survived everything the German army had thrown at them for 7 months, but survival had its limits. The human body and mind could only endure so much cold, so much fear, so much watching friends die, before something fundamental broke. What none of them knew, huddled in those frozen holes on December 28th, was that Foy would demand more from them than anything that had come before. They didn't know that the village was held by elite Waffen-SS troops from the 9th Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, veterans who had stopped the British at Arnhem, who had transformed every building into a fortified position. They didn't know that their company commander, newly assigned and inexperienced, would freeze under fire at the critical moment. They didn't know that taking Foy would cost nearly half their number in a single morning. They only knew that the village sat there on its slight rise, 2 miles away, controlling roads they needed and harbouring observers who called death down on them. And they knew, with the certainty that comes from 7 months of combat, that soon they would be ordered to cross the open ground between here and there. As darkness fell on December 28th, Captain Richard Winters stood alone near the command post, a damaged barn that offered minimal shelter. He opened his journal, a small notebook he kept tucked inside his jacket, and wrote by the light of a shielded candle. "The men are in no shape for this," he wrote, his handwriting cramped and precise. He didn't specify what this was, he didn't need to. Everyone from general to private knew an attack was coming. Winters closed the journal and looked north toward Foy, where German positions were invisible in the darkness, but no less real for being hidden. Somewhere in that village, German soldiers were also huddled against the cold, also waiting. The quiet before a battle has its own particular quality, a tension that builds in the silence, and on that frozen December night, the quiet stretched over the Belgian snow like a held breath before the scream. December 29th, 1944, General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, stood in a requisitioned farmhouse that served as division headquarters, studying aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across a wooden table. The photos showed Foy from above, a small cluster of buildings arranged along intersecting roads that looked innocent from this height. But Taylor had commanded airborne troops since before D-Day, and he knew how to read terrain. Foy sat approximately 50 feet higher than the surrounding landscape, a modest elevation that transformed into commanding high ground in the flat Ardennes. More importantly, 3 roads converged there, creating a bottleneck through which any advance northward had to pass. The village was a cork in a bottle, and until that cork was removed, the entire American push to link up with British forces attacking from the north would stall. The reconnaissance photos revealed details that couldn't be seen from ground level. Road N30, the main artery running north from Bastogne through Foy to Houffalize, cut directly through the village centre. 2 smaller roads intersected from east and west, creating a junction in the village square. During the German siege of Bastogne, Wehrmacht forces had used these roads to move supplies and reinforcements. Now the situation had reversed. Americans needed these roads for the same purpose, but German troops still held the critical junction. Intelligence estimated that elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen occupied Foy with approximately 125 to 150 infantry, supported by armour positioned in recon 800 metres to the east. These weren't demoralised conscripts or hastily assembled Volksgrenadier units. These were elite Waffen SS troops, some of the most experienced and ideologically committed soldiers the German army possessed. Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, joined Taylor at the map table. Sink had led the 506th since before the war, training the original volunteers, jumping with them into Normandy, pushing them through Holland and now Belgium. He pointed to the elevation lines on the tactical map. "Every vehicle we send north gets hit," he said flatly. "The Germans in that church steeple can see everything: trucks, tanks, troop movements. They're calling in artillery before our drivers can react." The casualty figures supported his assessment. Between December 26th and 29th, American forces around Bastogne had lost between 12 and 15 men per day to artillery fire directed from Foy. The math was brutally simple. 3 days equaled roughly 40 casualties, nearly a full infantry platoon, eliminated without any ground combat at all. 4 miles north of Foy lay the town of Neuville, where American armour needed to advance to maintain pressure on the retreating Germans. But the road to Neuville ran directly through Foy, and as long as German observers controlled the high ground, that road was a killing zone. Supply convoys attempted to use alternate routes, winding farm tracks that added miles and hours to every trip. Tanks avoided the main roads entirely, churning through snow-covered fields where they bogged down, or through tracks in frozen ruts. The inefficiency was crippling the momentum of the entire counteroffensive. Allied commanders knew that the Battle of the Bulge was turning in their favour. German forces were overextended, running low on fuel and ammunition. But knowing you're winning strategically provides no comfort when tactical realities prevent you from exploiting that advantage. Inside Foy, the situation looked very different. SS Hauptsturmführer, a rank equivalent to captain, commanded the defensive position, and he had used the weeks since the initial German offensive to prepare thoroughly. His troops had converted civilian homes into fortified strongpoints, knocking holes through interior walls to create covered movement routes, positioning machine guns in second-floor windows with overlapping fields of fire. Stone buildings that had sheltered Belgian families for generations became bunkers. Furniture was piled to create barricades and firing positions. Cellars were reinforced to serve as shelter from artillery. The defensive preparation followed German doctrine developed through 5 years of war. Defense in depth, mutually supporting positions, pre-registered artillery targets covering every approach route. The German observation post in Foy's church steeple represented a masterpiece of military utility. From that elevated position, observers could see for miles in every direction. They had 6 power by 30 binoculars, German military optics renowned for their clarity. A field telephone connected them directly to artillery batteries positioned 3 kilometers east, allowing them to call in fire missions within minutes. The observers worked in shifts, maintaining 24-hour surveillance. They recorded American movements in logbooks, noting patterns, identifying headquarters locations, tracking supply routes. When they spotted targets of opportunity, a cluster of vehicles, a group of soldiers gathering in the open, they relayed coordinates with practiced efficiency. Minutes later, 105mm shells would arrive, transforming American tactical positions into scenes of sudden violence. Belgian civilians caught in Foy experienced the military transformation of their village with helpless fear. Most families had fled when the fighting began in December, joining the streams of refugees clogging roads throughout the Ardennes. But approximately 30 people remained, mostly elderly residents, who refused to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations, or those too poor or sick to travel in winter. The Germans ordered them into cellars and warned them to stay there. An elderly woman named Marie Hallez, 12 years old at the time, would later describe hearing German soldiers above her family's cellar, the sound of boots on floorboards, furniture being moved, glass breaking as windows were knocked out to create firing ports. The soldiers were not cruel to the civilians, but they were not gentle either. The civilians were obstacles to be managed, mouths to feed when rations were scarce, potential problems if they tried to flee toward American lines. The strategic calculation at division headquarters balanced competing pressures. Every day Foy remained in German hands extended the timeline for the broader counteroffensive. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces throughout the Bulge salient were beginning a fighting withdrawal, falling back toward the German border under pressure from American forces pushing from the south and British forces attacking from the north. The goal was to trap and destroy as many German units as possible before they escaped, but that required rapid movement, aggressive pursuit, logistics flowing smoothly over captured roads. Foy, tiny and seemingly insignificant, had become a choke point that affected operations involving divisions and corps. General Taylor made his decision with the cold clarity that command requires. The 506th Regiment would attack Foy in force, using Easy Company from 2nd Battalion as the primary assault element, supported by Fox Company attacking from the west. Artillery would prepare the objective with a 15-minute barrage, after which infantry would advance across open ground and clear the village building by building. The attack was scheduled for January 13th, giving units 2 weeks to rest, receive replacements, and prepare. On paper, the plan was straightforward, almost textbook: suppress with artillery, advance under fire, close with, and destroy the enemy. But every officer who looked at the terrain photographs, who calculated the distance across open snow-covered fields, who considered the quality of German defenders, knew that textbook simplicity had a way of collapsing when bullets started flying. That night, in Foy's church steeple, a German observer scanned the American positions through his binoculars. He could see foxholes dotting the landscape to the south, occasional movement as soldiers rotated positions or brought forward supplies. He noted everything in his logbook with methodical precision. The Americans were digging in, strengthening their positions. That meant they were preparing for something, probably an attack. He reached for the field telephone to relay his observations to the battery commander. The guns would be ready. When the Americans came across those open fields, the artillery would be waiting. The observer didn't know names or faces, didn't know that the men in those foxholes included paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, who had survived Market Garden and Bastogne. He only knew coordinates, ranges, and fields of fire. In modern war, that was enough. December 20th through 27th, 1944. While American paratroopers shivered in foxholes outside Bastogne, German SS engineers inside Foy worked with systematic efficiency to transform a Belgian farming village into a fortified position designed to kill. These were not ordinary soldiers hastily pressed into defensive positions. The 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, had earned its reputation through brutal combat across multiple fronts. They had fought in Normandy, where American and British forces had struggled for weeks to break through their defences. They had stopped the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, turning that bridge too far into a killing ground. Now, in the frozen Ardennes, they applied lessons learned through years of combat to the problem of defending a village against inevitable American assault. An SS Unterscharführer, a sergeant equivalent, supervised the conversion of a Belgian family's stone house into a fortified strongpoint. The house sat on the eastern edge of Foy, offering clear views across the fields Americans would have to cross. The sergeant's squad worked through the freezing days with practiced efficiency. They knocked holes through interior walls using sledgehammers and pry bars, creating covered routes from room to room so defenders could reposition without exposing themselves to fire. Heavy furniture, wardrobes, tables, beds was dragged to windows and stacked to create barricades with narrow firing ports. The family's possessions, photographs and dishes, and children's toys were swept aside without ceremony. This wasn't personal. It was simply the physics of modern combat applied to medieval construction. The key to the defensive plan was the MG-42 machine gun, the weapon that gave German infantry squads firepower American forces struggled to match. The MG-42 fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a cyclic rate so high that individual shots blurred into a continuous ripping sound that American soldiers called Hitler's zipper. The weapon's effective range exceeded 1,000 meters, and its sustained fire capability allowed a single gun to dominate entire sectors of terrain. In Foy, SS troops positioned 6 MG-42 machine guns in carefully selected locations. Each gun covered an approach route, and the positions were mutually supporting. If Americans tried to flank one gun, they would expose themselves to fire from another. The overlapping fields of fire created a killing zone with no safe routes through it. Second-floor windows offered ideal firing positions. The elevation provided extended sight lines, allowing gunners to engage targets at maximum range. The stone walls of Belgian houses, some more than a foot thick, offered protection from small arms fire and even some artillery fragments. An SS machine gunner settled behind his MG-42 on the second floor of a house facing south, studying the terrain through the knocked-out window. He could see approximately 400 meters across open, snow-covered fields to the tree line where American positions began. The snow actually helped. Dark shapes would stand out clearly against the white background. He adjusted the gun's bipod, ensuring a stable platform, and checked the belt of ammunition feeding into the receiver. 2,000 rounds per position, the standing order read. That meant approximately 100 seconds of continuous fire per gun, or more realistically, 200 short bursts of 4 to 6 rounds each, enough to break up any infantry attack if the gunners maintained fire discipline. The defensive positions in Foy followed Wehrmacht doctrine developed since 1939 and refined through campaigns across Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, and now Western Europe. Defense in depth meant creating multiple layers of resistance rather than a single hard line. The outermost positions would engage attacking forces at maximum range, forcing them to deploy and reveal their strength. Intermediate positions would inflict casualties as the attack developed. The core defensive positions, concentrated around the village centre, would serve as the main line of resistance. Behind them, a small reserve, perhaps 20 men, could counterattack penetrations or reinforce threatened sectors. Artillery support was pre-registered on likely approach routes, meaning gunners had already calculated the exact coordinates and could fire almost immediately when observers called in targets. Supply runs brought ammunition forward during the nights when American observation was limited. Each MG-42 position received 2,000 rounds as ordered, the heavy ammunition belts distributed in metal cans that kept the rounds clean and dry. Rifle ammunition came in stripper clips, 15 rounds loaded into leather pouches distributed to each soldier. Stick grenades, the distinctive German potato masher design, were stacked in crates, 5 grenades per man. A mortar team set up in the churchyard, their 8-centimetre mortar positioned to drop shells on targets the machine guns couldn't reach. The mortar's high-angle fire could hit reverse slopes and dead ground, the areas where attacking infantry naturally sought cover. Everything was calculated, positioned, prepared. The SS troops defending Foy understood their strategic situation with clear-eyed realism. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, had failed to achieve its objectives. The drive to Antwerp had stalled, fuel shortages had immobilized armor, American resistance had been fiercer than intelligence predicted. Now, German forces throughout the salient were conducting fighting withdrawals, trading time and space for the preservation of forces that would be needed to defend the Reich itself. But withdrawal required coordination and control. Units couldn't simply retreat in panic. They had to fall back in stages, covering each other, maintaining cohesion. Foy served as a blocking position, a strong point that would delay American pursuit and allow other German units to disengage. The men holding Foy knew they were buying time with their lives, but that was the mathematics of defensive warfare. An SS Obersturmführer, a lieutenant, briefed his platoon leaders on their mission. Foy must hold for the offensive to succeed, he told them, which was both technically true and misleading. The offensive had already failed at the strategic level, but tactical success could still mitigate strategic failure. If Foy held for 3 days, it would save a regiment. If it held for a week, it might save a division. The junior officers nodded, understanding both the stated mission and the unspoken reality beneath it. They were expendable pieces in a larger game, but they were elite pieces, and they would be expensive to remove from the board. A wounded German soldier, hit during an American patrol 2 nights earlier, lay in the cellar of the house, being used as an aid station. The medic who treated him was efficient but not gentle. Morphine was in short supply, bandages had to be reused, infection was inevitable. The wounded man knew he wouldn't be evacuated. The roads east were under American artillery fire, and walking wounded were told to make their way back as best they could. Those who couldn't walk stayed in the cellars with the Belgian civilians, listening to the sounds of preparation above them, waiting for the battle they knew was coming. The medic finished bandaging the shrapnel wound in the soldier's shoulder and moved to the next casualty without comment. Compassion was a luxury that had been rationed away months ago. As January approached and the days remained locked in bitter cold, the SS troops in Foy settled into a routine defined by watches, patrols, and the constant maintenance that weapons required in winter conditions. They scraped ice from machine gun barrels, oiled actions that froze overnight, tested firing mechanisms in the pre-dawn darkness. They watched American positions through binoculars and calculated ranges to likely assembly areas. They knew the attack would come soon. You didn't dig in, so obviously unless you were preparing to advance, when it came, they would be ready. These were professional soldiers, ideologically committed to a cause that was already lost, but tactically focused on the immediate problem of defending a village against an enemy who outnumbered them and could call on artillery and air support they couldn't match. They would fight because that's what soldiers do, because orders were orders, because retreat without orders meant courts-martial or worse. And in the calculating way that soldiers everywhere understand, they knew their defensive advantages might balance the scales enough to make the Americans pay a price high enough to remember. January 9th, 1945, in a damaged barn serving as battalion headquarters, officers from Easy Company gathered around ammunition crates that had been arranged to form a crude table. Maps covered the wooden surfaces, tactical overlays marking German positions in red and American assault routes in blue. The morning light filtered through gaps in the barn's walls where artillery fragments had punched through. Captain Richard Winters stood at the head of the makeshift table, his breath visible in the cold air despite the small fire burning in a barrel in the corner. Around him stood the men who would lead the attack on Foy, platoon leaders, squad leaders, the newly assigned company commander. Their faces showed the strain of 7 months' continuous combat, but their attention remained focused as Winters began the briefing that would shape the battle to come. The plan, as Winters outlined it, followed standard infantry assault doctrine. Easy Company would attack from the south, advancing across approximately 400 metres of open ground to reach Foy's outer buildings. Fox Company would attack simultaneously from the west, creating a pincer movement that would divide German attention and prevent them from concentrating forces against a single approach. Artillery support had been allocated 8 105mm howitzers, would fire a 15-minute preparatory barrage starting at 08:45 on January 13th. The barrage would lift at 0900 exactly, and that would be H hour, the moment infantry began their advance. In theory, 15 minutes of artillery fire would suppress German defenders, destroy weapons positions, and create enough shock and confusion that American troops could close the distance before organised resistance could develop. Winters used a wooden pointer to trace the route on the map. 400 metres from our line to their positions, he said, tapping the map. Open ground, snow-covered, no cover, except for slight depressions in the terrain. Every officer in the room understood what that meant. 400 metres was the effective range of German machine guns. Every step of the advance would be made under potential fire from weapons that could deliver 1,200 rounds per minute. The snow would slow movement and make it harder to dig in if they came under fire. The white background would make them visible from extraordinary distances, and the slight depressions, Winters mentioned shell craters from earlier bombardments, natural folds in the terrain, were the only places men could seek cover if the advance stalled. Lieutenant Norman Deakey, recently assigned as Easy Company's commander, stood to Winters' left. Deakey had arrived in early January, transferred from a staff position to fill the combat leadership role that Easy Company desperately needed. On paper, his qualifications were adequate. He had completed officer training, served briefly in a line unit, and received his promotion based on evaluations that described him as competent and reliable. But the veterans in the room knew that paper qualifications meant little in combat. What mattered was whether an officer could make decisions under fire, whether he understood the difference between textbook tactics and the chaotic reality of men dying, whether he could earn the trust of soldiers who had survived everything from D-Day to Bastogne. Deakey had been with the company for 8 days. He had not yet been in combat with them. During the briefing, Deakey asked few questions. When Winters outlined the artillery support, Deakey nodded. When the assault route was described, Deakey nodded again. The other officers watched him carefully, looking for signs of competence or incompetence, but finding mostly silence. In combat units, silence from a commander could mean confidence, or it could mean paralysis. There was no way to know until bullets started flying. Sergeant Floyd Talbot, one of Easy Company's most experienced squad leaders, later told another NCO that Dyke's silence worried him more than if the lieutenant had asked stupid questions. At least stupid questions revealed what someone was thinking. The supporting artillery fire, 8 guns for 15 minutes, represented substantial firepower by infantry standards. Each 105mm howitzer could fire 3 to 4 rounds per minute in sustained bombardment, which meant approximately 280 to 300 rounds would land in and around Foy during the preparatory barrage. Each high-explosive shell created a casualty radius of approximately 35 meters. Under ideal conditions, soft ground that allowed fragments to spread, troops caught in the open, but conditions in Foy were far from ideal. The ground was frozen solid, which would reduce fragmentation effects. The German defenders were in stone buildings and prepared positions, not exposed in the open. The effectiveness of the barrage would depend largely on luck, whether shells landed directly on positions, whether roofs collapsed on defenders, whether enough psychological shock was created to disrupt the German defensive plan. Winters walked his officers through the timeline with methodical precision. At 0845, artillery would begin the preparatory barrage. At 0900, the guns would lift and infantry would move forward from their assembly area. At 0915, if the advance proceeded on schedule, lead elements should be entering Foy's outer buildings. By 0945, the village should be secured and companies would begin clearing operations, checking cellars, searching for bypass defenders, establishing defensive positions against possible counterattack. The timeline assumed resistance would be moderate, that artillery would significantly degrade German defensive capabilities, that casualties would be manageable. It was a reasonable plan based on standard assumptions about how infantry assaults developed. But Captain Richard Winters, who had led men in combat since June 6, 1944, knew the gap between plans and execution. That evening, after the briefing ended and the other officers dispersed to brief their squads, Winters sat alone in the barn and opened his personal journal. By candlelight, he wrote a single sentence that captured his private assessment: "The men are in no shape for this." He didn't elaborate, didn't specify whether he meant physical condition or psychological state or the simple accumulation of exhaustion that comes from too many battles without rest. He simply recorded his doubt and closed the journal. The assault plan distributed across Easy Company through squad briefings that night and the following day. Sergeants gathered their men in foxholes and damaged buildings, using rough sketches in the snow to illustrate the route, the objective, the plan. The soldiers listened with the particular attention that comes from knowing the briefing describes events where you might die. They asked practical questions. What about ammunition resupply? Where's the medic going to be? What if we get pinned down? The sergeants answered what they could and admitted ignorance about the rest. No plan survived contact with the enemy anyway. Everyone knew that. The goal was to understand the general idea so that when the plan fell apart, as it inevitably would, soldiers could make intelligent decisions on their own. The 400-metre advance across open ground dominated every conversation. Veterans who had fought in Normandy's hedgerows or Holland's streets knew that distance mattered less than cover. 400 metres through dense terrain with ditches and walls to hide behind was survivable. 400 metres across open snow against prepared positions was something else entirely. The mathematics were brutal. A MG-42 machine gun firing 4-round bursts at 800 rounds per minute could deliver 200 bursts during a 4-minute crossing. If even 10% of those bursts found targets, that meant 20 men hit. And Foy had 6 machine gun positions, at minimum. The veterans didn't share these calculations with the replacements. There was no point in terrifying men who would need all their courage to function when the moment came. But among themselves, in quiet conversations after dark, they spoke with fatalistic clarity about what was coming. January 12, 1945, Private First Class Edward Heffron sat in a foxhole with frozen fingers wrapped around a pencil, trying to write a letter home to Philadelphia. The paper kept threatening to blow away in the wind that swept across the Belgian landscape, and the pencil barely made marks on the cold paper. He wrote anyway, forming words that might be the last his family ever received from him. "Dear Mum," he began, then paused, unsure what to say. The attack was scheduled for tomorrow morning. He couldn't mention that in the letter. Censorship regulations forbade specifics about upcoming operations, but the knowledge of it hung over every word. He settled for safe phrases. He was doing fine. The food wasn't great, but adequate. He'd received her last package and shared the cookies with his squad. He didn't mention the cold that had become so constant it felt like a permanent condition. He didn't mention that his best friend had been wounded 3 days ago and evacuated. He didn't mention that tomorrow he would run across 400 metres of open ground while German machine guns tried to kill him. Across the perimeter, medic Eugene Rowe conducted inventory in the medical supplies shelter, a damaged house with intact enough walls to store equipment. Rowe counted bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, plasma. The numbers were inadequate, and he knew it. 23 morphine syrettes for a company of 89 men attacking a fortified position. 14 proper bandages, though he could supplement with torn cloth if necessary. The morphine worried him most. In winter combat, wounds that might be survivable in summer became lethal. The cold, accelerated shock, reduced blood flow, turned minor injuries into major medical emergencies. Morphine didn't heal anything, but it could keep a wounded man calm enough for evacuation, could ease pain enough that shock didn't kill faster than the wound itself. 23 syrettes meant 23 men could receive pain relief. When casualties exceeded that number, Rowe would have to make choices about who received morphine and who didn't. Sergeant William Guarnier, who everyone called Wild Bill, sat on an ammunition crate sharpening his trench knife with methodical, practiced strokes. The knife was a brutal piece of equipment, designed for close combat, when rifles became clubs, and survival depended on whatever weapon came to hand. Guarnier had returned to Easy Company against orders, walking out of a hospital in France and hitchhiking back to Belgium because, as he told anyone who asked, his men needed him more than the hospital needed his bed. He was 30 years old, ancient by paratrooper standards, and he had been in combat since June 6th. The knife's edge caught lamplight as he tested it against his thumb. Around him, other veterans prepared equipment with similar care, cleaning weapons, checking ammunition loads, tightening boot laces, going through rituals that gave the illusion of control over situations where control was impossible. A replacement soldier in combat for 8 days since arriving from the replacement depot approached a group of veterans with the hesitant manner of someone who knows he's interrupting. "What's it like?" he asked, the question vague but its meaning clear. What's it like to attack a fortified position? What's it like to run across open ground under fire? What's it like to kill or be killed? The veterans exchanged glances. How do you explain combat to someone who hasn't experienced it? Sergeant Talbot finally answered, "It's loud and confusing, and you do what you're trained to do until it's over." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was honest. The replacement nodded and walked away, not particularly reassured, but no more frightened than before. Equipment checks revealed problems that cold weather magnified. M1 Garand rifles, the standard infantry weapon, were reliable in normal conditions but struggled in extreme cold. The operating rod that drove the rifle's semi-automatic action sometimes froze if too much oil accumulated. Soldiers had learned to wipe their weapons almost dry, using minimal lubrication, but that created its own problems. Metal on metal wore faster, actions became rough. The Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, suffered similar issues but worse, because its more complex action had more points of potential failure. Magazines cracked in the cold, the metal becoming brittle. One squad leader discovered 3 cracked BAR magazines during inspection and had no replacements. He made a note to brief his bar gunner. "Single shots only. Don't stress the magazine with automatic fire." The age range in Easy Company spanned from 18 to 32, but the average age hovered around 23. These were young men, but they weren't boys anymore. 7 months of combat had aged them in ways that had nothing to do with years. The replacements, most of whom had arrived in December or early January, had some combat experience, but not the accumulated knowledge that came from surviving battle after battle. They knew how to fire their weapons, how to take cover, how to follow orders. What they didn't yet know was how to read a battlefield's rhythm, how to sense when a position was about to collapse or when a retreat was about to become a rout. They didn't yet have the veterans' ability to distinguish between fire that was dangerous and fire that was merely loud. They would learn tomorrow, if they survived. Personal loads for the attack ranged from 80 to 100 pounds per man. A rifleman carried his M1 Garand, weighing 9.5 pounds, 80 rounds of ammunition in cloth bandoliers, 2 fragmentation grenades, an entrenching tool, a canteen, a first aid kit, rations, and whatever personal items he refused to leave behind. A bar gunner's load was heavier. The weapon itself weighed 19.5 pounds, ammunition magazines added another 15 pounds, and he still needed the same basic equipment as a rifleman. Machine gunners and mortar crews carried even more, distributing weapons components and ammunition across multiple men. The weight became a physical burden that added to exhaustion, but it also represented the tools necessary for survival. You couldn't lighten your load by discarding ammunition, you might need every round you carried. Trench foot had become epidemic throughout the American forces in Belgium. 15% of Easy Company was on limited duty because of frozen feet, swollen and discoloured from weeks in wet boots in freezing conditions. The medical term was cold injury, non-freezing, but soldiers just called it trench foot, borrowing the name from World War I, when the same conditions produced the same results. The prescribed treatment was to keep feet dry and warm, which was impossible in foxholes filled with ice and snow. Men knew they should change socks regularly, but socks became precious commodities when supply lines struggled to deliver basic necessities. Some soldiers had been wearing the same socks for 2 weeks, the wool frozen to their feet. They would attack Foy on feet that hurt with every step, knowing that running 400 metres would feel like running 4 miles. As darkness fell on January 12th, soldiers settled into their positions for the last night before the attack. Some tried to sleep, curling into their frozen foxholes and wrapping themselves in whatever blankets or shelter halves they possessed. Others stayed awake, talking quietly with friends, smoking precious cigarettes, checking and rechecking equipment one more time. The veterans spoke about previous battles, telling stories that reminded them and their listeners that they had survived before and might survive again. The replacements listened and tried to draw courage from the stories, tried to believe that experience would protect them, that somehow knowledge of combat would translate into safety. Neither group mentioned the obvious, that every battle consumed some of the survivors, that luck eventually ran out, that tomorrow might be the day when statistics caught up with you and the bullet with your name on it finally arrived. January 13th, 1945, 08:45. The morning air hung frozen and still over the Belgian landscape as a forward observer with 2nd Battalion crouched in an observation post, field telephone pressed to his ear. He spoke coordinates into the receiver with practiced precision, numbers that represented lives and deaths reduced to map references. Fire mission, over, he said, and miles behind the American lines, artillery crews sprang into action around 8 105mm howitzers. The guns had been positioned overnight, ammunition stacked beside each piece, crews briefed on targets and timing, the gunners adjusted elevation and traverse according to calculated firing data. Then the battery commander gave the order that would announce to everyone within miles that the battle for Foy had begun. Fire. The first shells left the howitzers with flat, cracking reports that rolled across the frozen terrain. The projectiles arced high into the morning sky, 105mm rounds each weighing 33 pounds, travelling at nearly 500 metres per second. The flight time from gun to target was approximately 18 seconds, 18 seconds during which German defenders in Foy heard nothing, suspected nothing, and then the world exploded around them. The first impact struck the northern edge of the village at 08:45 exactly, high explosive shells detonating with sharp cracks that threw frozen earth and stone fragments in all directions. Roof tiles shattered, window frames disintegrated. The distinctive smell of cordite began to drift across the village as the artillery battery settled into its rhythm. Fire, reload, fire again. In a cellar beneath one of Foy's fortified houses, a German machine gunner counted impacts. He had experienced artillery barrages before in Normandy, in Holland, in earlier fights around Bastogne, and he knew that counting helped maintain mental control when everything above ground was chaos. 1, 2, 3, 4. The shells landed with irregular spacing, some close enough that dust shook from the cellar ceiling, others more distant. His squad leader, an SS Unterscharführer, with 2 years of Eastern Front experience, sat calmly against the stone wall. 15 minutes, the squad leader said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood American artillery doctrine. They'll fire for 15 minutes, then their infantry will advance. That's when we go upstairs. The machine gunner nodded and continued counting, the numbers giving order to chaos. The artillery barrage created impressive visual effects but less impressive tactical results. Each 105mm high explosive shell, under ideal conditions, created a casualty radius of approximately 35 metres. Anyone within that radius caught in the open faced death or serious injury from blast overpressure and fragments, but the conditions in Foy were far from ideal for artillery effectiveness. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of several inches, which meant shells didn't bury themselves before detonating. Surface bursts looked dramatic, throwing up large clouds of debris, but they were less lethal than buried explosions that sent fragments outward at ground level. More critically, the German defenders weren't in the open, they were in stone cellars and behind thick walls. A building could absorb multiple near misses, the walls dampening blast effects and stopping fragments. Approximately 280 shells landed in and around Foy during the 15-minute barrage. Some struck buildings directly, collapsing portions of roofs, blowing out walls, creating the kind of structural damage that would make defensive positions untenable. But most shells landed in streets, in yards, in the open ground around the village, dramatic impacts that accomplished little except to announce the impending attack. The smoke and dust created by the barrage drifted across Foy in clouds, obscuring visibility and giving American observers the impression that devastation must be total. Surely nothing could survive 15 minutes of continuous bombardment. Surely the German defenders must be dead or wounded, or at minimum shocked into paralysis. This was the assumption the attack plan relied on, and it was almost entirely wrong. When the artillery lifted at 0900, a strange silence fell across the battlefield. For exactly 30 seconds, no guns fired, no shells landed, no explosions shattered the air. In that brief quiet, soldiers on both sides drew breath and prepared for what came next. American paratroopers in their assembly areas checked weapons one final time, adjusted equipment, exchanged final words with friends. In Foy's damaged buildings, German defenders emerged from cellars and moved to their fighting positions. The machine gunner who had been counting shells climbed stairs to the second floor, his MG-42 already positioned at a window facing south. He settled behind the gun and looked out across 400 meters of snow-covered ground to the tree line where American positions began. He could see movement there, men rising from cover, forming into assault lines. The 15-minute barrage had killed approximately 2 Germans and wounded 8 to 12 more. One position took a direct hit, collapsing a portion of roof and killing both defenders. Another shell landed in the church courtyard where mortar crews had positioned their weapon, wounding 3 men but leaving the mortar intact. The remaining German defensive positions, the machine gun nests, the rifle positions, the observation post remained operational. The barrage had been impressive and violent and largely ineffective. As German soldiers returned to their fighting positions, as they checked weapons and prepared to engage targets, as they settled behind machine guns and sighted down rifle barrels, they understood that the Americans would come now, would cross that open ground, believing artillery had paved their way, would discover too late that stone walls and deep cellars protect against high explosives better than infantry doctrine accounts for. The forward observer who had called in the fire mission watched through binoculars as the last shells landed. Smoke obscured much of the village, and he couldn't see clear evidence of the barrage's effects. He picked up his field telephone to relay his assessment to battalion. Mission complete. Targets engaged. The clinical language didn't capture reality. Targets engaged didn't mean targets destroyed, but it followed proper procedure. His job was to call in fires, not to assess their effectiveness. That assessment would come when infantry advanced and discovered whether German defenders were dead, wounded, or waiting with loaded weapons. The observer checked his watch. 900 exactly. He raised his binoculars again and looked toward the American assembly areas. Any second now, the infantry would begin their advance. In the German observation post in Foy's church steeple, an observer had survived the barrage by descending to a reinforced room 1 level below the actual steeple. Now he climbed back up to his position, stepping over broken timbers and shattered glass. His binoculars had survived, and his field telephone still worked. He tested it, hearing the artillery battery commander's voice crackling through. "Stand by," the observer said into the phone. "American infantry forming for assault." He focused his binoculars on the American positions and began calling specific coordinates, adjusting previous calculations for exact positions. The German artillery batteries, positioned 3 kilometers east in concealed positions, trained their guns on the coordinates. When American infantry began crossing the open ground, German artillery would fire for effect, adding to the defensive fires from machine guns and rifles. The observer spoke numbers into the telephone, his voice calm and professional, announcing deaths that hadn't happened yet but were already calculated in fractions of degrees and meters of range. The 30 seconds of silence ended. Lieutenant Norman Dyke, standing in the assembly area with Easy Company formed around him, raised his whistle to his lips and blew. The sound cut through the morning air, high and sharp. Along the American line, sergeants repeated the command, "Move out, let's go." And with that, 89 men began walking across 400 meters of open snow toward a village where German soldiers waited behind loaded weapons. The artillery had spoken. Now the infantry would speak. And in Foy's fortified positions, Defenders sighted their weapons and prepared to answer with the particular eloquence that comes from MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute into soldiers with nowhere to hide. January 13th, 1945, 09:02. 89 American paratroopers rose from cover and began walking south to north across snow-covered Belgian farmland. They moved in a skirmish line, the standard infantry assault formation, each man maintaining approximately 5 meters of spacing from the soldiers to his left and right. The formation looked orderly from a distance, a line of dark figures against white snow, advancing with the methodical pace that training and discipline impose on men walking toward violence. Lieutenant Norman Dyke walked near the center of the line, whistle around his neck, rifle in hand. Behind the advancing soldiers, officers and NCOs, who would follow in a second wave, watched through binoculars. 400 meters to cross. At walking pace, approximately 4 to 5 minutes. The plan called for artillery to have suppressed German defences, for resistance to be scattered and disorganised. The plan was about to collide with reality. The first 100 metres passed in eerie quiet. The soldiers walked steadily, boots crunching in snow, breath visible in the cold air. No shots came from Foy's buildings. Some men began to hope that maybe, impossibly, the artillery had worked. Maybe the Germans were dead or fled or too shocked to fight. Maybe this would be easy. Veterans knew better than to hope, but even veterans can't entirely suppress the desire for survival. They walked through the quiet, weapons ready but not yet needed, the village growing larger with each step. Then, at approximately 150 meters from Foy's outer buildings, German artillery began falling. The shells landed behind the advancing line initially, hitting empty ground where men had been moments before, but the impacts announced that German observers were tracking them, adjusting fire, calculating the timing needed to catch infantry in the open. At 200 meters, the machine guns opened fire. The MG-42's distinctive sound, that ripping cloth noise faster than any Allied weapon, cut through the morning air from multiple positions. Traces arced outward from Foy's buildings, bright streaks that looked deceptively slow until you realized each visible tracer represented 4 non-visible bullets between them. The beaten zone, the area where machine gun fire, concentrated with lethal density, swept across the American line. Men instinctively hunched, making themselves smaller targets, but the skirmish line formation meant there was nowhere to hide. You maintained spacing and kept advancing, or you dove for cover and the attack stalled. Training said advance. Survival instinct said get down. For a moment, discipline held. Private First Class Edward Heffron was running now. Everyone was running. The walking advance abandoned as fire began finding targets. He saw a paratrooper to his left, a replacement, whose name he didn't know, take a burst across the chest and fall forward into the snow. The man fell heavily, the way bodies fall when life leaves them instantly. No attempt to catch himself or break the fall. Heffron kept running. You couldn't stop for wounded. Not yet. Not until the objective was reached. A medic would crawl out later, would reach the wounded under fire, would try to save whoever could be saved. Heffron's job was to keep moving forward, to close the distance to those buildings where the fire was coming from, to reach a point where his rifle would be useful instead of a weight in his hands. 250 meters from Foy. 150 more to go. The attack began to fragment. Some men dove into shell craters from the earlier artillery barrage, seeking any cover the landscape offered. Others kept advancing, running in short bursts, from one slight depression in the ground to another. The skirmish line's neat geometry dissolved into clusters of men, trying desperately to reach the village, while German fire intensified. An MG-42 firing from a second-floor window had a perfect field of fire across the entire approach route. The gunner traversed methodically, firing 4 to 6 round bursts, each burst aimed at a different target. The cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute meant he could engage multiple soldiers in seconds. Load, aim, fire. Another American paratrooper fell. Load, aim, fire. Another went down, clutching his leg. At 300 meters, Lieutenant Norman DK stopped running. He stood in the open, fully exposed to fire, but he wasn't moving forward or giving orders. He seemed frozen, locked in place by indecision or fear, or the simple, overwhelming sensory assault of modern combat. Around him, men looked to him for direction, for orders, for leadership. What they saw was an officer who had stopped functioning. A sergeant nearby screamed, "Keep moving," to his squad, trying to maintain momentum through force of personality, since leadership from above had evaporated. But individual NCOs couldn't coordinate an entire company assault. The attack required someone to make decisions about where to concentrate force, which positions to suppress first, when to commit reserves. DK made no decisions. He simply stood, holding his rifle, staring toward Foy. Medic Eugene Rowe moved forward through the chaos with the focused purpose that medical training creates. He ran in a low crouch toward a wounded paratrooper who was screaming for help, the man's leg shattered by machine gun fire. Rowe slid into cover beside him, his aid bag already open. The leg wound was bad femur, broken, femoral artery possibly nicked, blood soaking through the man's uniform. Rowe applied a tourniquet above the wound, tightening it until blood flow slowed, then injected morphine. The wounded man's screaming subsided to whimpers. Rowe marked his forehead with an M in grease pencil, morphine administered, don't give him more, and moved to the next casualty. He had 23 morphine syrettes in his aid bag when the attack began. 5 minutes in, he had 18 left. The mathematics of trauma medicine in combat were simple and brutal. Too many wounded, too few supplies, decisions about who gets treatment and who doesn't. Sergeant William Guarner, running with his squad, saw Dyke's paralysis and knew the attack was failing. You couldn't take a fortified position with men pinned in the open, leadership frozen, casualties mounting. He tried to rally his squad to keep them moving, but German fire was too heavy. An MG-42 swept across their position, forcing everyone down. Guarnery pressed himself into a shallow depression in the snow that offered almost no cover. Bullets cracked overhead, that distinctive supersonic snap when rounds passed close. He could see Foy's buildings, could see muzzle flashes from German positions, but he was pinned 300 meters short of the objective, with no clear way forward, and a company commander who had stopped giving orders. In battalion headquarters, Captain Richard Winters stood at an observation post watching the attack through binoculars. He could see the skirmish line dissolving, men going to ground, the advance stalling. He could see Lieutenant Dyke standing motionless while soldiers around him tried to continue the assault without direction. Through the binoculars, Winters watched Easy Company, his company, the men he had trained and led since D-Day, being destroyed piece by piece by German machine guns that should have been suppressed by artillery but weren't. He watched men fall, watched others seek cover that didn't exist, watched an attack fail in real time. The radio operator stood beside him, headset on, monitoring the battalion net. Static and fragmented transmissions came through. We're stuck. Need orders. Casualties mounting. Winters made a decision that would alter the battle. He keyed the radio and spoke 4 words that would end one officer's career and begin another's legend. Get Dyke out. Send Spears. January 13th, 1945, 09:15. Captain Richard Winters stood in the battalion observation post, radio handset pressed to his ear, making a decision that violated every conventional rule about command continuity, but followed the deeper rule that leaders exist to save lives when systems fail. Lieutenant Norman Dyke had frozen under fire, and men were dying because of it. Winters could watch the attack collapse and follow proper procedure, maintain chain of command, don't relieve officers mid-battle, wait for the situation to resolve itself, or he could act. He acted. Get Dyke out. He repeated into the radio, his voice carrying the flat certainty of command. Send Spears in. Now, across the battlefield, runners moved to execute the order, carrying a message that would transform the battle's outcome in ways nobody could predict, but everyone would remember. Lieutenant Ronald Spears received the order while positioned with the reserve platoon 500 meters behind the stalled assault. Spears was 25 years old, but carried himself with the bearing of someone who had made peace with death long ago. He had been with the 506th since D-Day, had built a reputation that mixed professional competence with disturbing rumours. Some men said he had shot German prisoners on June 6th. Others said he had personally killed 20 enemy soldiers in close combat. What everyone agreed on was that Spears seemed immune to fear in ways that were either inspiring or psychopathic, depending on your perspective. He never took cover when everyone else did. He walked through fire that sent other men diving for foxholes. He led from the front in ways that were suicidal, except that somehow he never died. When the runner delivered Winters' order, Spears didn't hesitate. He didn't gather his equipment or brief his platoon or take a moment to assess the situation. He simply started running toward the sound of gunfire, crossing the same 400 meters of open ground that had pinned Easy Company, running alone while German machine guns tracked American soldiers with methodical fire. The men who watched him run later struggled to describe it in ways that made sense. "He just ran," one paratrooper said in an interview decades later, "straight up, full sprint, like he was running for a bus. I thought he'd get cut down in the first 50 meters, but the bullets that found other men somehow missed Spears. He ran through the beaten zone of multiple machine guns, across ground where Easy Company lay pinned, closing the distance to Foy in what seemed like impossible time. The German machine gunner who had been firing from the second floor window saw Spears running and swung his MG42 to track this new target. A single American soldier running alone made no tactical sense. Was this some kind of distraction, a sacrifice to draw fire? The gunner settled his sights on the running figure, led him slightly to account for movement, and squeezed the trigger. A 6-round burst stitched across the snow where Spears should have been, but Spears had changed direction slightly, an unconscious combat instinct that saved his life. The gunner corrected and fired again, missed again. Before he could fire a third burst, Spears disappeared into dead ground, a slight fold in the terrain that provided temporary cover. Spears reached Easy Company's pinned elements at 09:17, 13 minutes after the attack had begun, and 12 minutes after DK had frozen. The soldiers lying in shell craters and shallow depressions looked up to see Spears arriving, not even particularly winded from his 400-meter sprint under fire. "Follow me," he shouted, the two words cutting through the noise of battle with absolute authority. He didn't explain the change in command, didn't waste time on formal transition procedures. He simply stood up, fully exposed to German fire, and started running toward Foy. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If Spears could stand and run, maybe they could too. If this crazy officer was willing to lead from the front, maybe following him was possible. One by one, then in groups, then as a renewed wave, Easy Company's soldiers rose from cover and advanced. The attack that had been dying suddenly revived. Where moments before men had been pinned and leaderless, now they had direction and momentum. Spears ran toward the nearest building, his Thompson submachine gun firing from the hip, not aiming so much as suppressing any German position that might engage him. Behind him, paratroopers followed in rushes, using the covering fire that squad members provided for each other. The textbook tactics they had trained on fire and movement, bounding, overwatch, suppression, and advance emerged from the chaos because someone was coordinating them, directing fire, pointing out targets, making split-second decisions about where to commit force. A German MG42 position that had been dominating a sector of the battlefield suddenly came under concentrated rifle fire from multiple angles. The gunner, trying to track Spears and multiple other targets simultaneously, made the fatal mistake of losing fire discipline. He held the trigger down too long, burning through his ammunition belt in a long burst that missed everything it aimed at. In the seconds it took to reload, American paratroopers closed the distance to his building. A grenade came through the window, exploding in the room with a sharp crack. The machine gun went silent. Spears didn't stop at the first building. In a decision that became legendary in retellings, he continued running completely through the German defensive positions in Foy, across the village, through enemy-held territory, and linked up with Fox Company attacking from the west. The distance he covered was approximately 250 meters through the village itself, past German soldiers, who were so surprised by his sudden appearance that they hesitated fatally before firing. He ran through rooms where German defenders crouched, past windows where rifles tracked him, across streets swept by machine gun fire. By every tactical calculation, he should have died. Veterans who witnessed it couldn't explain how he survived except to invoke luck or fate or divine protection. But the tactical effect of Spears' run mattered more than its miraculous nature. By physically linking Easy and Fox companies, he coordinated their attacks in real time, directing forces to support each other, identifying German strongpoints that needed concentrated assault. The two-company attack that had been fragmenting into separate, uncoordinated battles became unified again. German defenders, already surprised by the renewed American assault, now found themselves caught between two forces that were communicating and coordinating. The defensive plan that relied on defeating attacks sequentially began to collapse when attacks came simultaneously from multiple directions. Captain Richard Winters, watching through binoculars from battalion headquarters, saw the attack's character change within minutes of Spears taking command. The stalled assault became fluid movement. The pinned soldiers became advancing infantry. The failed attack became a successful penetration of German defensive positions. Winters lowered his binoculars and spoke to the officer beside him. That's what leadership looks like. It was a simple statement that carried layers of meaning. Leadership wasn't about rank or formal authority. It was about willingness to risk everything, to lead from the front, to make the impossible seem achievable through sheer force of example. Spears had demonstrated that in the most visceral way possible, and Easy Company had responded by transforming from defeated to victorious in the space of minutes. The battle for Foy wasn't over. Clearing the village would take hours more, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The attack would succeed, not because of artillery preparation or tactical superiority, but because one man had run 400 meters under fire and refused to believe death could catch him. January 13th, 1945, 09:30. The first American paratroopers reached Foy's outer buildings, with Lieutenant Ronald Spears directing them like a conductor, orchestrating violence. The open ground assault had cost blood and time, but now the character of combat changed from exposed advance to close quarters fighting, where buildings became both cover and trap. Sergeant William Guarnier led his squad toward a stone house on the village's eastern edge, a two-story structure with intact walls and blown-out windows. German fire still came from multiple positions deeper in the village, but this building was quiet, which meant it was either abandoned or held by defenders waiting for Americans to enter kill zones. Guarnier signaled his squad to stack up against the wall beside the door. One man pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it through the nearest window. The explosion inside was muffled by stone walls, but unmistakable. 3 seconds later, Guarnier kicked the door open and entered with his Thompson submachine gun leading. The interior was chaos-made architecture. Furniture had been piled to create barricades, walls knocked through to create firing lanes between rooms, floors littered with debris from the earlier artillery barrage. A German soldier lay dead near the window, killed by the grenade that had announced the American entry. Blood pooled beneath him, still liquid, in the relatively warm interior. The house smelled of cordite and stone dust, and something else, something organic and wrong that soldiers learned to recognize as the smell of recent death. Guarnier's squad moved room by room, weapon sweeping corners, checking behind barricades, clearing spaces with the practiced efficiency that came from doing this in Normandy, in Holland, in 24 other buildings across 24 other villages. Clear the ground floor first, then stairs, then second floor, then cellar. Standard procedure that kept you alive if you followed it exactly and killed you if you improvised. Upstairs, a German MG-42 position had been firing on American positions throughout the assault. The crew, a gunner and an assistant who fed ammunition belts, heard Americans entering below and faced an immediate tactical problem. Stay at the window and fire on targets outside while Americans cleared the building behind you, or abandon the position and try to fight room clearers with weapons designed for long-range fire. They chose to stay, hoping to kill more Americans before the inevitable. A paratrooper named Martin reached the stairs first, moving with his rifle raised. The stairs turned at a landing, creating a blind corner. As Martin rounded it, the German assistant gunner fired a pistol down the stairwell. The range was less than 5 meters. The bullet hit Martin in the chest, punching through his jacket and the flesh beneath. He fell backward down the stairs, his rifle clattering on wooden steps. The German's pistol shot revealed his position. 2 paratroopers at the base of the stairs opened fire up the stairwell, not aiming at specific targets, but simply pouring rounds into the space where the shot had come from. Wood splintered, plaster exploded from walls. The volume of fire was enough to force the Germans away from the stairwell, buying seconds. A sergeant pulled Martin to safety. The wounded man was conscious, breathing, the wound serious but not immediately fatal. Medic Eugene Rowe, who had entered the building behind the assault element, went to work on Martin while the fighting continued above him. Rowe worked with the focused calm that separated good medics from dead ones, his hands moving through practiced motions. Cut away clothing, assess wound, apply bandage, inject morphine. Martin's eyes tracked Rowe's movements, aware enough to understand he'd been shot, but in enough shock that pain hadn't fully registered. The squad couldn't advance upstairs while Germans held the second floor with clear sight lines down the stairwell. The tactical problem had a brutal solution. If you can't advance through, go around or through walls. A soldier with a bazooka, an anti-tank rocket launcher, pressed into service against buildings, positioned himself near a wall that separated the ground floor from the stairwell. The bazooka fired with a distinctive whoosh and backblast that filled the room with smoke. The rocket hit the wall at point-blank range, punching through stone and mortar with explosive force. The wall didn't collapse, but it opened a hole large enough to throw grenades through. 2 fragmentation grenades went through the hole, exploded on the second floor, and the German machine gun position went silent. The gunner and his assistant were killed by fragments, their bodies found later, sprawled across the MG42 they'd been defending. Throughout Foy, similar small unit actions played out in parallel. Fox Company, attacking from the west, cleared buildings with the same room-by-room methodology. German defenders fell back toward the village centre, conducting a fighting withdrawal that contested every structure. Some SS troops barricaded themselves in rooms and fought until killed. Others withdrew through knocked-through walls and back doors, maintaining cohesion as they retreated to secondary positions. The German defensive plan had anticipated this phase. The initial assault would be stopped in the open, but if Americans penetrated the outer defences, fall back in stages, make them pay for every metre. The plan was working insofar as American casualties mounted with each building cleared, but it was failing strategically because the defence couldn't hold indefinitely against attackers who had momentum. Belgian civilians, huddled in cellars throughout this fighting, experienced the battle as sound transmitted through stone. Explosions, gunfire, screaming in German and English, and sometimes no language at all, just the sounds humans make when wounded or dying. Marie Hallez, 12 years old, crouched with her family in their cellar while combat raged in the rooms above. They had been there for 3 days, eating the last of their stored food, drinking water from bottles that had frozen during the nights. The sounds of fighting moved through their house, boots on floors, furniture being moved, an explosion that shook dust from the ceiling joists. Marie's father held his family close and prayed in French, his words barely audible over the violence. They didn't know whether Germans or Americans held the floor above them, didn't know if they should reveal themselves or stay hidden. Emerging at the wrong moment could mean death from frightened soldiers who shot first in the chaos of building-to-building combat. By 10:30, American forces controlled approximately half the village. The German defenders had withdrawn to positions around the church and the eastern edge of Foy, still resisting but no longer able to coordinate a cohesive defence. The SS Hauptsturmführer, commanding the defence, faced the same problem commanders had faced since warfare began: when to withdraw and save your force versus when to hold and sacrifice it. His orders said hold Foy, but his tactical sense said the position was untenable. American infantry had penetrated too deeply, had split his force into isolated pockets, had achieved numerical superiority through weight of assault. If he stayed, his men would be killed or captured to no strategic purpose. If he withdrew, at least the survivors could fight another day. He made his decision and passed orders through runners. Withdrawal to Recon, 800 metres east, where German armour and fresh infantry could establish new defensive positions. The German withdrawal was professional and disciplined, characteristics that made it all the more dangerous. SS troops didn't simply flee, they covered each other, provided suppressing fire while elements moved, maintained small unit cohesion even in retreat. American paratroopers pursuing them into the eastern edge of Foy encountered fierce resistance from rearguard positions. One house held 6 German soldiers who fought from behind barricades until a bazooka round set the building on fire, forcing them out. 3 were killed in the street, 2 surrendered, 1 escaped into the winter landscape. Another position held until hand grenades cleared it room by room, American soldiers killing Germans at ranges where they could see their faces. By 11:45, organised German resistance in Foy had ceased. The village, or what remained of it, was in American hands. Buildings showed the scars of combat. Walls pocked with bullet holes, roofs collapsed from artillery, windows blown out, doors hanging from broken hinges. Bodies lay in streets and rooms, German and American both. The dead distinguished by uniforms but unified in stillness. Easy Company and Fox Company soldiers began the grim work of consolidating positions, checking cleared buildings for bypass defenders, searching German dead for intelligence documents, marking American casualties for recovery. The village that had been an objective, a target, an enemy strong point, became simply a place where men had fought and some had died, and now the survivors had to figure out what came next. Medics moved through the captured buildings, treating wounded of both sides, because that's what medics did. The Geneva Convention and human decency both demanded it. Wounded Germans received bandages and morphine alongside wounded Americans. both groups experiencing the particular mercy that comes when someone tries to ease your pain even though you were enemies minutes ago. January 13th, 1945, 1200 hours. Medic Eugene Rowe worked in what had been a German aid station in a Foy cellar, now converted to American use, with the simple efficiency of combat medicine. The cellar smelled of blood and antiseptic, and the particular sweetness of sucking chest wounds that every medic learned to recognize and dread. 18 men lay on stretchers or blankets spread across the stone floor, wounds ranging from superficial to mortal. Rowe moved between them with depleted supplies and exhausted hands, making rapid assessments based on who could be saved and who was already beyond saving. His morphine was gone, all 23 syrettes used in the first 2 hours of combat. Now he relied on pressure bandages, sulfur powder to prevent infection, and plasma for soldiers in shock. The plasma came in bottles that had to be held above wounded men, while gravity drew life-sustaining fluid into their veins. There weren't enough hands to hold all the bottles, so some were hung from exposed ceiling beams with strips of bandage. Outside the aid station, in a snow-covered field 300 metres from Foy Centre, Sergeant William Guarnier and Sergeant Joe Toye sat together against a tree, both wounded by the same German artillery shell that had landed as they moved between positions. The shell had been fired by German batteries in Reorganizing, a final burst of defensive fire as SS troops withdrew from Foy. The explosion caught both sergeants in its fragmentation pattern, shrapnel tearing through legs and lower bodies, with the indiscriminate violence that made artillery the war's greatest killer. Guarnieri looked down at where his right leg had been. It ended mid-thigh now, the rest gone in an instant of blast and fragment. Toye's left leg was similarly destroyed, hanging by tissue that would need surgical removal. Both men had received morphine from the medic who reached them first. Enough to dull but not eliminate the pain, enough to keep shock from killing them before evacuation arrived. They sat together, because that's what soldiers do when wounded, seek comfort from friends who understand without explanation. Guarnier, even through morphine haze and shock, tried to joke. "At least we'll get to go home," he said, his voice weak but carrying the South Philadelphia accent that identified him immediately to anyone who knew him. Toye, normally quiet and serious, managed a response. "Yeah, Bill, real lucky." They both knew what losing legs meant. Their combat careers were over. Their time with Easy Company was finished. They would be evacuated to hospitals in France, then England, then eventually home to America, where they would spend months in recovery and rehabilitation, learning to walk on prosthetics, adjusting to civilian life with bodies permanently altered by a single artillery shell. Around them, medics and litter bearers organised casualty evacuation, prioritising by severity, calling for jeeps to transport stretcher cases to the aid station in Bastogne, 4 miles south. Captain Richard Winters conducted a roll call at 1300 hours, gathering Easy Company's survivors to account for who remained. The names he called echoed across captured German positions. Heffron, "Here, sir." Talbot, "Here, sir." Libgott, "Here, sir." But 24 names received no answer. 24 men who had advanced across that snow-covered field that morning would never answer another roll call. Some had died instantly, killed by machine gun fire during the advance, or by artillery during the village clearing operations. Others had died of wounds, bleeding out before medics could reach them, or succumbing to shock despite treatment. Their bodies lay scattered across the battlefield, in the positions where they fell, in the open field, in Foy's streets, in buildings where close quarters combat had been decided by seconds and inches. The casualty count told the battle story in numbers that felt abstract, until you remembered each number was a name, a face, a story that ended here. 18 killed in action, 24 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, 42 total casualties from a company that had begun the assault with 89 men, a casualty rate of 47%, nearly half the attacking force eliminated in approximately 3 hours of combat. By military standards, these were acceptable losses for a successful assault on a fortified position. By human standards, they were devastating. Every man lost was someone's son, many were brothers, some were husbands or fathers. The telegram that would reach their homes in coming weeks would use phrases like "killed in action" or "died of wounds received," clinical language that couldn't capture the specific ways they died or the chaos of the moments that killed them. German casualties were estimated rather than precisely counted. Accurate numbers would require going through enemy dead and wounded, checking identification, compiling lists. Initial estimates suggested 35 Germans killed, 60 or more wounded, 40 captured, and in American custody. The captured Germans sat in a guarded area near Foy's church, hands on heads or bound with wire, expressions ranging from relief at survival to anger at capture to blank exhaustion. Some were teenagers, 16 or 17 years old, pressed into service as Germany's manpower reserves dwindled. Others were veterans in their 30s, men who had fought since Poland or France, who had survived Russia and retreated through Europe, now prisoners in a Belgian village whose name they probably hadn't known before being ordered to defend it. The body recovery detail began its grim work in early afternoon, teams of soldiers moving across the battlefield to locate and identify American dead. Each body received basic field processing, checked for identification tags, record name and serial number, searched for personal effects to return to family, moved to temporary collection point for later burial. The frozen ground made the work physically difficult. Bodies were stiff with cold, had to be pried from ice, lifted with careful handling that honoured what they had been, even though they were now simply remains. Private Edward Heffron volunteered for recovery detail because one of the dead was his close friend, a paratrooper named Muck, who had been killed during the village clearing. Heffron wanted to ensure his friend was handled with dignity, wanted to say goodbye in whatever way combat allowed. He found Muck's body in a shell crater, covered in snow that had fallen during the battle. He brushed the snow away and sat beside his friend for a moment, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. The evacuation chain moved wounded from battlefield to battalion aid station in Foy, to regimental aid station in Bastogne, to field hospital in Luxembourg. The journey could take 6 to 8 hours in winter conditions, jolting rides in the backs of jeeps over frozen roads that turned every bump into agony despite morphine. Some wounded died during evacuation, succumbing to shock or blood loss or complications that field medicine couldn't address. Others survived the trip and underwent surgery in hospitals where doctors and nurses worked 20-hour shifts trying to save boys whose bodies had been torn apart by high-velocity metal. Sergeant Guarnier and Sergeant Toy made the journey together, still conscious, still talking when morphine allowed, both understanding that this was the end of their war, but not yet processing what that meant for their futures. Lieutenant Ronald Spears, who had run through machine gun fire and enemy positions and emerged without a scratch, walked through Foy in the afternoon, assessing positions and checking on men. Soldiers who saw him approach felt a complex mixture of emotions, awe at what he had done, gratitude that his leadership had saved the attack, and a certain wariness because anyone that fearless was either blessed or cursed, and you couldn't tell which. Spears showed no particular emotion about his actions. He had done what needed doing, had made the impossible look achievable, and now he was focused on the tactical situation, where to position defences, how to organise watches, what to do if Germans counterattacked from recon. He was already thinking ahead to the next battle because that's what combat leaders did, process the current situation and prepare for what came next. As darkness fell on January 13th, Easy Company occupied the village they had bled to take. Men established defensive positions in the same buildings Germans had defended that morning, converting them back to American use, with the understanding that every fortification works equally well for whichever side holds it. Foxholes were dug in frozen ground, sentries posted, fields of fire established. The soldiers were exhausted beyond anything. Most of them had experienced 24 hours without sleep, 3 hours of maximum stress combat, and now the adrenaline crash that made bodies shake and minds struggle to process commands. But they were professionals, and professionals did their jobs regardless of how they felt. They cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, ate K rations, and prepared for German counterattack that intelligence said might come at dawn. The village was theirs now, bought with American blood, held against whatever came next. And in the darkness, wounded men screamed in aid stations, bodies lay cold in collection points, and somewhere far away in Philadelphia and Chicago and small towns across America, families were about to receive the worst news of their lives. January 13th, 1945, 1800 hours. Darkness fell over Foy with the abruptness that winter brings at northern latitudes, transforming the captured village into a landscape of shadows and uncertainty. American paratroopers established defensive positions in buildings they had assaulted that morning, converting German firing positions to American use with minor adjustments. The same second-floor window that had held a German MG-42 now held an American machine gunner scanning the eastern approaches where intelligence suggested German forces in Recon might counterattack. The stone walls that had protected SS troops now protected paratroopers, the logic of defensive architecture, indifferent to which army occupied it. 47 men from Easy Company remained combat effective after casualties were evacuated. 47 soldiers to hold a village the Germans had defended with 125. The mathematics suggested vulnerability. Lieutenant Ronald Spears, now officially commanding Easy Company after Lieutenant Dyke's relief, walked the defensive perimeter with his platoon leaders, identifying weak points and assigning positions. His leadership style differed sharply from conventional approaches. He didn't consult or build consensus. He simply pointed and gave orders with the expectation of immediate compliance. But the men responded because his combat performance that morning had earned credibility that no amount of formal authority could provide. When Spears said to position a machine gun at a particular window, soldiers positioned it there without question. When he designated a building as the company command post, it became the command post. Authority in combat derives less from rank than from demonstrated competence, and Spears had demonstrated competence in the most visible way possible. Belgian civilians began emerging from cellars as darkness fell, tentatively at first, checking whether the violence had ended. Marie Hallis and her family climbed stairs from their cellar to find their home transformed. Furniture was destroyed, walls damaged by small arms fire, windows gone, the cold wind blowing through rooms that had been warm before the battle. But they were alive, and American soldiers in their kitchen were heating rations over a small fire built in what remained of their stove. The soldiers, exhausted and filthy, looked up as the family appeared. For a moment, both groups assessed each other with the wariness that comes from days of violence. Then one paratrooper, using broken French supplemented with gestures, offered food from his K-ration. The family accepted, and the kitchen became briefly a place of shared humanity rather than military occupation. Throughout Foy, similar scenes repeated as approximately 28 surviving Belgian civilians emerged from hiding. Some found their homes destroyed beyond immediate repair. Others found American soldiers apologetic about the damage but focused on defensive preparation rather than civilian concerns. The dynamic was complicated. These were liberators, but liberators whose combat had destroyed the village they liberated. An elderly woman approached Captain Winters and offered hidden food stores, potatoes and preserved vegetables her family had concealed from German requisitions. Winters accepted gratefully. His men hadn't had hot food in days. The woman asked, through a translator, whether Americans would stay to protect them if Germans returned. Winters couldn't promise anything. His orders were to hold Foy, but orders changed based on situations he couldn't control. German artillery began ranging on Foy at 1900 hours, single shells landing at irregular intervals as enemy gunners probed for American positions. The shells fell in streets and yards, occasionally hitting buildings, creating the constant tension of waiting for the next impact without knowing where it would land. This was harassment fire, designed more to prevent rest and create psychological stress than to cause casualties. But psychological stress accumulated into real effects. Men couldn't sleep between impacts, couldn't relax enough to eat properly, couldn't lower their guard. An artillery shell killed one paratrooper who had survived the morning assault, caught him in the open between buildings, tearing his body apart with the random injustice that characterized artillery death. His squad mates recovered what remained and added him to the casualty count that would be reported to battalion. 19 killed now instead of 18. Listening posts were established 200 meters north and east of Foy, small teams of 2 or 3 men positioned in frozen shell craters or behind walls, their mission to provide early warning if Germans approached. The soldiers selected for this duty understood they were tripwires. If a major attack came, their job was to report it and fall back, not to hold ground. They settled into positions with weapons, ammunition, radios, and field telephones connected by wire to the company command post. The night vision of soldiers who had been in combat for months was excellent, eyes adjusted to darkness, ears trained to distinguish between wind sounds and human movement. They listened to the night and watched the darkness, and tried not to think about how exposed they were if German patrols came hunting for American positions. Intelligence reports relayed from battalion to company indicated significant German movement in Recon and the villages beyond. Vehicle sounds, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations all suggested the 9th SS Panzer Division elements were regrouping. Whether they would counterattack to retake Foy or continue withdrawing toward Germany remained unclear. American commanders prepared for the worst-case counterattack at dawn with armor support while hoping for the best-case continued German withdrawal. The soldiers in defensive positions didn't speculate about German intentions, they simply prepared for whatever came. Machine guns were positioned to cover likely approach routes. Rifle positions were improved with whatever materials were available. Fields of fire were cleared by moving furniture or knocking additional holes in walls. If Germans came, Foy would be as difficult to take from Americans as it had been to take from Germans. A wounded German soldier, left behind during the SS withdrawal, lay in a Foy cellar receiving treatment from American medics. He had been shot through the shoulder during the village clearing and overlooked in the chaos of German retreat. When paratroopers searching buildings found him hours later, he was semi-conscious from blood loss and shock. Eugene Rowe, the medic, treated him with the same care given to American wounded: pressure bandage, sulfur powder, plasma. The German soldier, 19 years old and terrified, kept saying "nicht schießen" over and over, "don't shoot." The Americans didn't shoot. They patched his wounds, gave him water, and designated him a prisoner of war to be evacuated with other casualties. The war's violence created strange intimacies where yesterday's enemies became today's patients. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped further, reaching the bitter cold that turned breath to ice and made weapons freeze if not constantly maintained. Soldiers on watch wrapped themselves in whatever they had: blankets, shelter halves, captured German coats, and stamped their feet to maintain circulation. The night stretched ahead with the particular quality that combat nights have, time moving slowly when exhaustion demands sleep but danger demands vigilance. Some men dozed in shifts, never fully asleep, always partially aware of sounds and movements. Others stayed fully awake, too wired from adrenaline or too afraid of nightmares to close their eyes. The veterans knew this feeling, had experienced it after Normandy and Holland and Bastogne, the night after combat, when your body is safe but your mind is still processing violence. In the command post, Lieutenant Spears and his senior NCOs reviewed plans for the next day. If Germans didn't counterattack, American forces would push toward Recolne and Cobru, maintaining pressure on the retreating enemy. If Germans did counterattack, the plan was to hold Foy and call for artillery support to break up the assault. Either way, Easy Company would be involved. 47 men who had already given everything being asked to give more. Spears studied maps by candlelight, calculating distances and timelines, working through tactical problems with the focus that kept minds occupied so they didn't drift to thoughts of friends dead or wounded. Commanding combat meant living in the future, always planning the next operation, because dwelling on the present operation meant processing casualties and trauma that would interfere with decision-making. So Spears planned, and his NCOs prepared, and outside the command post, soldiers waited in the cold darkness for dawn or Germans or whatever came next in a war that seemed to have no end. January 14th through 15th, 1945. In a requisitioned farmhouse, 8 kilometers east of Foy, SS Sturmbannführer, commanding the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen's remaining elements studied tactical maps with growing frustration. His division, once a powerful armoured formation of 15,000 men and 200 tanks, had been reduced to approximately 40% combat effectiveness through months of continuous fighting. The losses weren't just numbers. They represented destroyed vehicles that couldn't be replaced, killed veterans whose experience couldn't be replicated, consumed supplies that logistics couldn't replenish. The Battle of the Bulge, intended as Germany's decisive counteroffensive to split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had failed catastrophically. Now the question wasn't whether to withdraw, but how to preserve enough force to defend Germany itself. The maps showed a salient collapsing from both sides like a closing fist. American forces pushed from the south, British and Canadian forces attacked from the north, and German units throughout the Bulge faced encirclement if they didn't retreat immediately. Intelligence reports estimated that Allied pincers would meet within 48 to 72 hours, trapping any German forces that remained in the salient. The SS commander's orders from Corps headquarters were clear: withdraw all units east of the Bastogne-Houffalize line by January 20th. Fighting withdrawals were authorized to cover movement, but no units were to sacrifice themselves in suicidal defensive stands. Germany needed these soldiers alive for the battles that would be fought on German soil when Allied armies crossed the Rhine. Foy, lost the previous day, represented a tactical setback but not a strategic disaster. The village had served its purpose, delaying American advance for 2 weeks while other German units withdrew. The casualties inflicted on American paratroopers, 42 men by German estimates, based on observation, had been bought at a cost of approximately 75 German casualties, but even that unfavourable exchange ratio mattered less than time purchased. 2 weeks of delay had allowed German divisions further north to disengage and retreat in good order. That was the cold mathematics of defensive warfare. Trade, space, and lives for time that allows army-level preservation. The SS commander made his decision and issued orders through radio and dispatch riders. All units withdraw towards Street Vith, then toward the German border. Rearguards would cover the withdrawal, but were specifically ordered not to conduct major counterattacks unless strategically necessary. The decision to abandon Foy without counterattacking reflected realities beyond local tactical considerations. German fuel supplies, critical for mechanized warfare, had reached crisis levels. The offensive had been planned, assuming captured Allied fuel depots would sustain the advance, but American forces had denied those depots. Now German armour moved intermittently, conserving fuel, sometimes towed by horses or other vehicles. The Panther and Tiger tanks that remained operational in Racon consumed massive amounts of fuel. A single Tiger tank required approximately 270 litres per 100 kilometres. Moving armour from Racon to counterattack Foy and then back to defensive positions would consume fuel better saved for withdrawal movements. Without fuel, tanks became 40-ton bunkers, useful for static defence but unable to manoeuvre. American reconnaissance patrols, moving cautiously north and east from Foy on January 14th, reported abandoned German positions. The houses and buildings in Racon that had held German troops the previous day were empty by morning, showing signs of hasty departure. Equipment left behind, documents partially burned, defensive positions unmanned. The paratroopers advancing expected contact, moved with weapons ready, but found nothing except evidence that an army had been there and departed. The same pattern repeated in Cobru and the farmlands between villages. German forces were withdrawing faster than American forces could pursue, falling back according to plans that prioritized preservation over territory. Intelligence officers at division headquarters analyzed the withdrawal with professional assessment. Radio intercepts indicated large-scale German movement eastward across multiple sectors. Prisoner interrogations confirmed orders to withdraw. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, rare now that Allied air superiority was absolute, had decreased to almost nothing, suggesting German command knew their forces were visible and vulnerable but couldn't prevent it. The strategic picture became clear. The Battle of the Bulge was ending not with dramatic final battles, but with German armies retreating before they could be trapped and destroyed. The Allies were winning, but German forces were escaping to fight another day. For the American paratroopers holding Foy, the lack of counterattack brought relief mixed with a curious sense of anticlimax. They had prepared for desperate defence, had positioned machine guns and pre-registered artillery targets and organised fields of fire. The absent German attack meant they had bled to take Foy, only to discover Germans didn't want it back. Captain Richard Winters, visiting Easy Company positions on January 15th, tried to frame it positively. We took the objective and held it. That's success by any measure. But soldiers who had watched friends die for that objective struggled with the knowledge that Germans had abandoned it voluntarily hours later. Success? Yes, but at what cost and for what gain? The strategic significance of Foy shifted from tactical strongpoint to logistics node. The roads that German observers had made impassable now carried American supplies forward. Convoys of trucks moved through Foy, carrying ammunition, fuel, rations, winter clothing to units pursuing the German withdrawal. The village that had been a fortress became a traffic junction, its value measured in tons of supplies moved rather than terrain controlled. Within a week, engineers improved the roads, established supply dumps, created the infrastructure that modern armies require to function. Foy faded from tactical importance to become another small Belgian village, where a battle had been fought and was now remembered only by those who fought it. The 9th SS Panzer Division continued its withdrawal through late January, fighting rearguard actions when necessary, avoiding contact when possible, preserving force for defensive battles that would come when Allied armies reached the Rhine. The survivors of the Foy garrison integrated into other units or returned to the division's reforming elements. Some would die in later battles in the Rhineland or the Ruhr. Others would survive the war and return to Germany to find their country destroyed, their cause defeated, their sacrifice rendered meaningless by strategic failures far above their level of control. The SS troops who had defended Foy fought well by military standards, but fighting well wasn't enough when your nation's strategic position was hopeless. American commanders, processing after-action reports and casualty lists, drew lessons that would inform future operations. The Foy assault reinforced existing doctrine about artillery preparation. 15 minutes wasn't enough against fortified positions in winter conditions. It demonstrated the critical importance of competent small unit leadership. One officer's paralysis nearly defeated an entire attack. It showed that elite enemy troops would defend tenaciously even when strategic situation was hopeless. These lessons were compiled in reports that would be studied at military academies, incorporated into training programs, used to educate future officers about the gap between planning and execution. The battle became a case study, an example, a data point in the larger analysis of how infantry combat functioned. But on the night of January 15th, as soldiers in Foy cleaned weapons and tried to sleep in captured German positions, strategic analysis mattered less than immediate reality. They had attacked across open ground, lost nearly half their number, taken a village that Germans abandoned anyway, and tomorrow they would wake and receive orders for the next operation. The war continued regardless of casualties or doubts or exhaustion. It continued because wars only end when one side can no longer fight or both sides agree to stop, and neither condition existed yet. So the soldiers slept when they could, ate when food was available, maintained their equipment, and prepared for whatever came next. The counterattack that didn't come meant they were alive today, and in combat, that was the only victory that mattered on a personal level. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight they were alive in a captured village, and that was enough. January 20th, 1945, in a damaged building serving as battalion headquarters, a clerk typed after-action reports on a portable typewriter, translating combat into the bureaucratic language that military organizations require. The report for Easy Company's assault on Foy followed standard format: objective identified, forces committed, actions taken, casualties sustained, lessons learned. The casualty figures appeared in a table: 18 killed in action, 24 wounded and evacuated, 42 total casualties from 89 men committed. Below the numbers, the assessment: objective secured, casualties considered acceptable given enemy defensive preparations and tactical situation. The word acceptable carried enormous weight, suggesting mathematical relationship between cost and gain that reduced human lives to variables in military calculus. Captain Richard Winters read the draft report and felt the gap between official language and lived experience. Acceptable casualties didn't capture Sergeant Guanair and Sergeant Toye losing legs to the same artillery shell, didn't describe Private Muck dying in a shell crater 300 metres short of the objective, didn't account for the 18 families who would receive telegrams explaining their sons or husbands had been killed in action at a place called Foy that they'd never heard of and couldn't find on a map. Winters had commanded these men since D-Day, knew their names and faces and stories. The 24 friends he'd lost weren't acceptable, they were tragic and necessary, and both things simultaneously. He signed the report because that's what command required, but the signature felt heavy. The strategic analysis presented different mathematics. Military planners at division level calculated that securing Foy had enabled the advance toward Houffalize to proceed 3 to 4 days faster than if the village had remained in German hands. Those 3 days mattered because German units were withdrawing on tight schedules, and every day of delay potentially trapped more enemy forces before they could escape. If Foy's capture enabled the encirclement of one German battalion, approximately 500 men, then the strategic gain arguably justified the tactical cost. If it saved American casualties elsewhere by allowing smoother logistics and faster advance, the mathematics balanced. Strategic warfare operated on these calculations, accepting losses here to gain advantages there, optimizing across entire theaters rather than individual battles. But soldiers didn't experience war strategically. They experienced it personally. Private Edward Heffron, sitting in a foxhole outside Foy 5 days after the battle, knew only that his close friend was dead, and no amount of strategic justification changed that fact. The mathematics that made Foy's cost acceptable at division headquarters felt meaningless when applied to specific human relationships. His friend had been real, someone who told jokes, who shared cigarettes, who talked about Philadelphia and girls and what he'd do after the war. That specific person was gone, replaced by abstractions like casualties and losses that fit into reports but couldn't capture absence. Heffron would live the rest of his life with that absence, would think about his friend at unexpected moments, would wonder what life his friend might have lived if artillery hadn't found him outside Foy. The supply route calculation provided cold vindication of Foy's value. By January 25th, 200 tons of supplies per day moved through Foy toward American units advancing north. The road that German observers had made lethal now sustained 6 divisions, with ammunition, fuel, rations, replacements. Engineer units widened the road, improved its surface, established supply dumps and maintenance facilities. Foy became a logistics hub supporting operations across the northern Ardennes. If those supplies saved American lives, if soldiers fought with adequate ammunition, if tanks didn't run out of fuel, if wounded received treatment faster, then Foy contributed to Allied victory in ways that transcended its local tactical significance. The mathematics suggested that 42 American casualties might have prevented 100 or 200 casualties elsewhere, though such calculations remain speculative. Replacement soldiers arrived at Easy Company on January 18th through 22nd, 30 new paratroopers, fresh from training to fill the gaps left by casualties. They arrived with new equipment and new faces and new questions about how to survive combat. The veterans, those who had been with the company since D-Day or Normandy or at least Bastogne, looked at the replacements with weary assessment. Some would prove competent, would learn quickly, would become valued members of the unit. Others would panic in their first firefight or make fatal mistakes, or simply be unlucky. The veterans couldn't tell which replacements would survive and which wouldn't. Combat was the only test that mattered. So they provided basic advice: keep your head down, do what sergeants tell you, don't try to be a hero, and prepared for the next operation where some of these new faces would become casualties that required replacement in turn. The broader Battle of the Bulge casualty figures provided context that made Foy's losses appear modest by comparison. American forces throughout the Ardennes fighting suffered approximately 89,000 casualties between December 16th and January 25th. 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. Easy Company's 42 casualties represented 0.047% of the total, a statistical footnote in a battle that involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But statistical insignificance at army level didn't diminish significance at unit level. To Easy Company, the battle for Foy wasn't a footnote. It was the single most costly action they'd fought since Normandy, the day they lost nearly half their number in 3 hours. Veterans processing their experiences in the days after battles struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. Sergeant Floyd Talbot, speaking with Sergeant Carwood Lipton, articulated what many felt: we did what we had to do. The village had to be taken. But that doesn't make it easier knowing guys died for it. Lipton, pragmatic by nature, responded with the fatalism that sustained soldiers through multiple combat operations. We don't get to choose the missions. We just execute them and try to keep as many guys alive as possible. It was acknowledgement without acceptance, recognition that military necessity existed, but didn't erase the human cost it exacted. The question of whether Lieutenant Dyke's paralysis had increased casualties occupied quiet conversations among veterans. If leadership had been competent from the start, if the attack hadn't stalled in the open, would fewer men have died? Impossible to know with certainty, but military analysts who later studied the battle estimated that the 13-minute delay before Spears took command likely resulted in 30% of the casualties, perhaps 12 men killed or wounded who might have survived, with immediate, aggressive leadership. That calculation damned Dyke, but also acknowledged that combat leadership is extraordinarily difficult, that officers crack under pressure, that institutional failures in training or assignment or psychological screening contributed to putting an inadequate leader in a critical position. Lieutenant Ronald Spears, promoted to command Easy Company permanently, said little about Foy afterward. When soldiers praised his run through German positions, he deflected with characteristic brevity: we took the objective. That's what matters. His unwillingness to dwell on individual heroics reflected a perspective that saw combat as job rather than drama. Buildings needed to be cleared, machine guns needed to be suppressed, enemy positions needed to be taken. How you accomplished those tasks mattered less than accomplishing them. Spears would command Easy Company through the remainder of the war, would continue leading from the front with the same reckless courage that had saved Foy's assault, would survive against all probability to become one of the most decorated officers in the regiment. As January ended and the Battle of the Bulge officially concluded, with German forces driven back to their starting positions, Easy Company remained in Belgium, occupying defensive positions, conducting patrols, waiting for the next phase of operations. They didn't know that the worst fighting lay ahead, crossing the Rhine, liberating concentration camps, invading Germany itself. They only knew that Foy was behind them, another place where friends had died, another entry in the company's combat history. The mathematics of loss balanced differently for each man. Some found meaning in strategic success, others found only absence and grief. Most found both intertwined in ways that made simple assessment impossible. War, they were learning, didn't offer clean answers about whether sacrifices were worthwhile. It offered only the fact that sacrifices had been made, objectives secured, and the war continued regardless of how individuals felt about the costs they'd paid. 1974, nearly 30 years after the battle, Marie Halles Desenfants, now 41 years old, sat in her kitchen in Foy, answering questions from an American historian researching the Battle of the Bulge. Her house was different than the one she'd lived in during the war. That building had been too damaged to repair, but it occupied the same plot of land where she had spent 3 days in a cellar listening to combat rage above. What do I remember most? She repeated the question in French-accented English, considering the noise, the absolutely unbearable noise that never stopped. And then the silence when it ended. And that was almost worse, because you didn't know if they were still there, waiting. Her hands moved unconsciously as she spoke, gestures that suggested seeking shelter, covering ears, pressing close to family. The Belgian civilian experience of Foy's battle had been one of helpless terror mixed with pragmatic survival. When German forces occupied the village in December, residents who remained were ordered into cellars and told to stay there. Food supplies dwindled over weeks as soldiers requisitioned what they needed. Water froze in wells and had to be thawed inside. Families huddled together for warmth in spaces designed for storage, not habitation. When American artillery began falling on January 13th, civilians couldn't distinguish between preparation barrage and building collapse, between small arms fire and artillery impact. They only knew that violence was happening above them and they were trapped below, unable to flee, unable to fight, completely dependent on luck for survival. Jean-Baptiste de Senfans, Marie's father during the war, had died in 1968, but before his death, he recorded an oral history interview with a Belgian historian. His account described the moment American soldiers entered their house while fighting continued elsewhere. We heard boots on the floors above, heard English being spoken. My wife wanted to go up immediately, but I held her back. You don't know if soldiers in combat will shoot first when surprised. We waited until the fighting moved to other buildings, then we climbed the stairs slowly with our hands visible. The American soldiers, boys, really, most of them younger than my sons, were heating food. One of them offered us a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I took it anyway because it seemed important to accept his kindness. The destruction of Foy had been comprehensive. Of 65 buildings in the village, approximately 40 sustained damage during the battle, ranging from minor broken windows, small arms damage to catastrophic collapsed roofs, walls destroyed, structures uninhabitable. 15 buildings were destroyed completely and later demolished. The church, Foy's architectural and spiritual centre for generations, lost its steeple to artillery fire. The same observation post that had directed German fire onto American positions became the structure's fatal weakness when American gunners targeted it specifically. The steeple collapsed during the battle, crashing through the roof and damaging the interior. The church would be rebuilt in 1948 using American aid funds, but it never looked quite the same. Belgian casualties during the battle numbered 8 total, 3 killed in the crossfire during building-to-building combat, 5 dying in the weeks after from exposure, malnutrition, or complications from injuries sustained during the battle. An elderly woman named Josephine Muris died of a heart attack in her cellar while artillery fell above her. A child, 7 years old, was killed by a stray bullet that penetrated a cellar wall. Tragic evidence that stone walls provided protection but not invulnerability. 3 men attempting to flee the village during the battle were caught in the open and killed by machine gun fire, their bodies not recovered until after the fighting ended. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars. Hearing damage from explosions, nightmares that persisted for years, a permanent wariness about loud noises that never entirely faded. The peculiar nature of repeated occupation created its own trauma. Foy had been occupied by German forces in 1940 during the initial invasion of Belgium. 4 years, when German soldiers were a constant presence, when Belgian civilians learned to navigate occupation's compromises and dangers. Liberation in September 1944 brought American forces and brief hope that the war was over. Then the Battle of the Bulge reversed the situation. Germans returned in December, reoccupied the village, imposed military control again. For Belgian civilians, this cycle occupation, liberation, reoccupation, final liberation, created psychological whiplash. Marie Hallez Desenfants described it simply: "We learned not to trust that anything was permanent. The armies came and went, and we were always just trying to survive whichever army was there." Post-war reconstruction of Foy relied heavily on American aid through the Marshall Plan and specific programs targeting battle-damaged communities. The Belgian government and American military both recognized that communities caught in combat zones deserved assistance rebuilding. Engineers surveyed damage, architects designed repairs or replacements, construction crews rebuilt over several years. By 1950, Foy looked almost normal again. New buildings alongside repaired old ones, roads restored, utilities functioning. But the visible reconstruction couldn't repair psychological damage or bring back the dead. The village that existed after the war was physically similar to, but fundamentally different than the village that existed before. A memorial was established in 1947, a simple stone monument in Foy's reconstructed square, listing the names of Belgian civilians killed during the Battle of the Bulge, and specifically during the January 1945 battle. The monument included a plaque thanking American forces for liberation, but also acknowledging the cost that liberation imposed on civilian residents. The wording was carefully diplomatic: gratitude for freedom, mourning for losses, hope that such violence would never return. Veterans who later visited the memorial often found the civilian perspective jarring. Americans remembered Foy as a tactical objective successfully taken. Belgians remembered it as the place where their homes and sometimes their families were destroyed. The relationship between Belgian civilians and Allied soldiers was complex, mixing genuine gratitude with resentment at devastation. Americans had liberated Belgium from German occupation, yes, but the method of liberation involved combat that destroyed civilian property and killed civilians caught in the crossfire. Marie Hallez Desenfants articulated this complexity. Were we grateful? Yes, absolutely. Did we also resent that our village was destroyed? Also yes. Both things were true. The soldiers weren't trying to hurt us, they were fighting Germans. But we still lost everything. This dual consciousness, gratitude and resentment intertwined, characterized many civilian experiences in battle zones across Europe. By the 1990s, few Belgians who remembered the battle firsthand remained alive. The children who had hidden in cellars were now elderly, their memories decades old, but still vivid in specific details. The sound of explosions, the smell of cordite and plaster dust, the cold of January cellar imprisonment. Younger generations knew the battle mainly through family stories and the memorial in the village square. Foy became one of dozens of Belgian communities where battles had been fought, where American soldiers had died, where civilians had been caught between armies. The specific details faded into general knowledge that this region had been a battlefield, that war had passed through and left scars that time gradually healed but never entirely erased. 1992, nearly 50 years after the battle, at the United States Military Academy at West Point, an instructor in the Department of Military History used Foy as a case study in a course on small unit leadership under extreme stress. The cadets, aspiring officers in their late teens and early 20s, studied tactical maps showing the assault route, read after-action reports, watched interviews with surviving veterans. The instructor posed the central question that made Foy relevant beyond its tactical insignificance. What happens when a commander freezes in combat? And what does that teach us about leadership selection, training, and accountability? The classroom discussion that followed touched on psychology, institutional responsibility, combat stress, and the cruel reality that military organizations sometimes promote officers based on peacetime performance that doesn't predict combat competence. Lieutenant Norman Dyke's paralysis during the Foy assault became infamous through Band of Brothers, the book and later television series that brought Easy Company's story to popular attention. The portrayal was harsh, DK depicted as cowardly or incompetent, a man who endangered his soldiers through failure at the critical moment, but military historians who studied the primary sources found a more nuanced picture. Dyke had served competently in staff positions, had led patrols without incident, had no prior history suggesting he would freeze. What he lacked was extensive small unit combat leadership experience under conditions of extreme stress. He had been assigned to Easy Company in January 1945, given 8 days to integrate into a veteran unit, then ordered to lead a complex assault against elite defenders. The institutional failure lay in assigning an experienced officer to command a company of combat veterans in a critical operation. Captain Richard Winters, in post-war interviews, provided the most balanced assessment. Dyke wasn't a bad officer, Winters explained in a 1987 interview. He was an officer put in a position he wasn't ready for. The Army needed combat commanders, so they moved staff officers to line positions without adequately preparing them. That's not Dyke's fault, that's a systemic problem. Winters' analysis shifted blame from individual to institution, acknowledging that military organizations sometimes fail their officers by placing them in roles they're not equipped to handle. Dyke had frozen not because he was fundamentally incompetent, but because combat's sensory overload and life-or-death decision-making exceeded his psychological preparation. The question of shell shock, what modern medicine calls post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated Dyke's story further. He had been at Bastogne, had experienced the siege's constant artillery bombardment, had seen men killed and wounded around him. Evidence suggests he was already suffering psychological trauma when assigned to lead Easy Company. The Army in World War II had limited understanding of combat stress, no systematic methods for identifying officers whose psychological state made them unfit for combat command. DK may have been suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, a condition that manifested as confusion, inability to make decisions, and withdrawal under stress. If so, his freezing at Foy was a symptom of trauma rather than cowardice, a distinction that changes moral assessment even if tactical consequences remained the same. Lieutenant Ronald Spears presented the opposite case study, an officer whose psychological makeup seemed uniquely suited to combat leadership, but whose methods raised ethical questions. The rumors about Spears that he had killed prisoners, that he collected German military decorations from dead enemies, that he took unnecessary risks suggested someone operating outside normal moral boundaries. Veterans described him with mixture of admiration and unease. You wanted Spears leading you in combat because nothing scared him, one paratrooper said. But you also wondered, what kind of person has no fear? That's not normal. Spears' run through German positions at Foy demonstrated courage that inspired men and turned the battle's outcome, but it also demonstrated judgment that bordered on reckless. If he had been killed, and by probability he should have been, Easy Company would have lost its only effective leader at the critical moment. The 13-minute delay between when DK froze and when Spears took command likely resulted in approximately 30% of American casualties, perhaps 10 to 12 men killed or wounded during that period. This calculation, based on analysis of when casualties occurred during the assault, suggested that leadership competence directly affected survival rates in measurable ways. The military lesson was clear. Leaders must be able to function under extreme stress, must make rapid decisions when information is incomplete and stakes are lethal. Training and selection processes needed to identify officers who could perform under these conditions and remove those who couldn't. But identifying such officers before combat remained extraordinarily difficult. Peacetime exercises, no matter how realistic, couldn't fully replicate combat's psychological intensity. Post-battle, Lieutenant Dyke was quietly reassigned to a staff position where his administrative competence could be useful without placing soldiers at risk. He received no disciplinary action. Officially freezing in combat wasn't a court-martial offence unless it rose to the level of cowardice in the face of the enemy, which required proving intent to avoid combat rather than simply being overwhelmed by it. DK served out the war in staff roles, returned to America, and largely disappeared from military history, except as a cautionary example. Interviews with him are rare. Understandably, he had no desire to discuss the worst moment of his life repeatedly. He died in 1989, his obituary mentioning military service without details about Foy. Lieutenant Spears, promoted to captain and given permanent command of Easy Company, continued leading with the same aggressive style through the rest of the war. He survived battles in Germany, survived the war entirely, and later served in Korea, where he earned additional decorations for valor. His post-war military career included service in both Asia and Europe, rising to lieutenant colonel before retiring. The risks he took, especially that run through Foy, became legendary in airborne community, told and retold as examples of extraordinary leadership. But historians noting his survival against such improbable odds sometimes asked whether his example was useful or dangerous. Useful because it demonstrated that courage could inspire and transform outcomes. Dangerous because it suggested taking suicidal risks was acceptable leadership behaviour. The broader military lesson from Foy centred on selection and preparation of small unit leaders. After World War II, The Army developed more sophisticated methods for identifying combat leadership potential, including stress inoculation training that exposed officers to simulated combat pressure. Psychological screening improved, attempting to identify indicators of how individuals might respond to extreme stress. Relief of commanders mid-battle, while remaining rare, became accepted practice when immediate failure threatened mission success. Foy's example, both Deke's failure and Spears' success, taught that leadership in combat was sui generis, that it required psychological characteristics that were partly innate and partly trained, but always critical to unit survival. Officers who couldn't function under fire endangered their soldiers, regardless of their peacetime competence. Modern military academies use Foy to teach cadets about the weight of command, the responsibility that comes with having soldiers' lives depend on your decisions. The case study isn't about condemning Dyke or lionizing Spears. It's about understanding the enormous pressure that combat leadership entails and preparing future officers to handle that pressure effectively. When the instructor at West Point finished the Foy case study, he asked his cadets a question with no comfortable answer. If you were in Winter's position, watching an attack fail because your company commander froze, would you have the moral courage to relieve him mid-battle? And if you were in Dyke's position, overwhelmed by sensory overload and unable to function, would you have the self-awareness to relinquish command before men died? The classroom fell silent, cadets confronting the gap between textbook answers and human realities. 1946. At the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, senior officers gathered for a series of seminars analyzing lessons learned from World War II combat operations. The Ardennes campaign, including the Battle of the Bulge and subsidiary actions like Foy, received particular attention because winter warfare in Europe had exposed gaps in American doctrine, equipment, and training. Lieutenant Colonel attached to the Operations Analysis section presented findings from detailed study of infantry assaults on fortified positions during winter conditions. Foy appeared in the presentation as one of multiple case studies demonstrating that current artillery doctrine failed to adequately suppress defenders in stone buildings when ground was frozen and defenders were disciplined. The artillery lesson from Foy challenged fundamental assumptions about preparatory bombardments. Standard doctrine called for 15 minutes of preparatory fire before infantry assaults, with the expectation that this would kill or suppress most defenders. Foy demonstrated that 15 minutes against prepared positions in winter was insufficient. Analysis showed that frozen ground reduced artillery effectiveness by approximately 30 to 40% compared to soft ground because surface bursts created smaller fragmentation patterns. Stone buildings provided better protection than expected. Walls more than 30 centimeters thick could withstand near misses, and even some direct hits without collapsing. German defenders in cellars survived barrages that should have destroyed them. The doctrinal adjustment was clear. Winter assaults on fortified positions required longer bombardments, heavier weapons, or different tactics entirely bypass and isolate rather than frontal assault. Equipment failures during extreme cold weather prompted extensive post-war modifications. The M1 Garand rifle, generally reliable, had jammed during Foy when oil thickened in sub-zero temperatures. New specifications required weapons lubricants that remained liquid at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Browning automatic rifle received similar attention after magazines cracked in cold. Weapon maintenance procedures were revised to emphasize minimal lubrication in extreme cold conditions. Cold weather uniforms improved dramatically. The Army developed layered clothing systems, better insulated boots, improved gloves that allowed weapon operation while providing protection. These changes came too late for soldiers who fought at Bastogne and Foy, but they benefited later generations. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, validated or invalidated lessons from Ardennes winter combat depending on how thoroughly those lessons had been institutionalized. American forces in Korea's brutal winter of 1950-51 faced similar conditions: sub-zero temperatures, frozen ground, enemy defenders in stone buildings or caves. Officers who had studied Foy and similar battles knew to request extended artillery preparation and to expect that prepared positions would survive bombardment, but institutional memory is fragile. Many Korean War units relearned lessons that Foy had already taught at the cost of American lives. An infantry captain in Korea later wrote, "We found ourselves clearing stone villages in winter against entrenched defenders, and it was exactly as difficult as it had been described in World War II after-action reports. We should have known better. but somehow each generation learns these lessons in blood again. Urban warfare tactics evolved significantly based on World War II combat experiences, including Foy. The army formalized military operations in urban terrain, known as MOUT, as a distinct tactical discipline requiring specialized training. MOU doctrine emphasized clear buildings systematically, room by room, use grenades before entry, create multiple entry points to avoid predictable approaches, maintain communication between clearing teams, prepare for close quarters combat where rifles become less useful than pistols or hand-to-hand weapons. Training facilities were constructed to replicate urban environments where infantry could practice building clearing before facing it in combat. Foy's lessons that clearing buildings takes time, that casualties are inevitable, that leadership at squad level becomes critical were incorporated into training scenarios. The leadership lessons from Foy influenced officer evaluation systems and training programs. The Army developed more systematic methods for assessing combat leadership potential, including stress exercises where officer candidates made rapid decisions under time pressure and incomplete information. Psychological screening attempted to identify officers who would freeze under pressure. Though this remained an imperfect science, human response to life-threatening stress is difficult to predict from peacetime testing. The doctrine of relieving commanders mid-battle when mission success was threatened became more accepted, codified in regulations that balanced respect for chain of command with recognition that failed leadership endangered soldiers' lives unnecessarily. Historical preservation of Foy and similar battlefields served both commemorative and educational purposes. The terrain around Foy remained largely unchanged, the same fields American paratroopers crossed, the same slight elevations that provided German defenders advantages. Modern armies used these preserved battlefields for staff rides, bringing officers to historical sites to walk the ground, study decisions made, discuss alternatives that might have produced different outcomes. A staff ride to Foy involved walking the 400 meters from American assembly areas to the village while instructors explained tactical situation, defensive preparations, leadership failures and successes. The exercise made abstract lessons concrete. Standing on ground where men fought and died provided visceral understanding that classroom study couldn't replicate. By the late 20th century, technology had transformed warfare in ways that made direct comparison to Foy difficult, but kept underlying principles relevant. Modern artillery used precision guidance that World War II gunners couldn't imagine, but the fundamental problem suppressing defenders in fortified positions remained. Modern infantry had night vision, advanced body armor, digital communication systems, but clearing buildings still required soldiers entering rooms where enemies waited. The technology changed, but the human dynamics of small unit combat, the importance of leadership, the value of training, the role of courage and fear remained constant. Foy taught lessons about those human dynamics that transcended technological epochs. The study of Foy at contemporary military institutions focuses less on replicating tactics. No modern commander would execute an assault identical to Easy Company's, and more on understanding principles. How do you maintain unit cohesion when casualties mount? How do you recognize when leadership is failing and what actions are appropriate? How do you balance mission accomplishment against force preservation? What does it mean to say casualties are acceptable, and who has authority to make that determination? These questions, first asked by men freezing in Belgian snow, remain relevant to officers making decisions about modern operations where soldiers still die when leadership fails or when missions exceed capabilities. The final lesson from Foy was perhaps the simplest and most profound. War costs more than after-action reports capture. The official record showed casualties, objectives achieved, time required. But the complete cost included Belgian civilians made homeless, soldiers permanently disabled, veterans living with psychological trauma decades after families destroyed by telegram notifications. Military organizations struggle to incorporate these diffuse costs into decision-making because they're difficult to quantify and compare across alternatives. How do you weigh strategic value of a village against specific human lives? The answer isn't mathematical, it's moral, political, and personal. Foy taught that armies must attempt these calculations, but also that the calculations are always inadequate, always incomplete, always unable to fully capture what is asked of soldiers and civilians when war comes to their specific piece of ground. 1995, 50 years after the battle, surviving veterans of Easy Company returned to Foy for ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. Approximately 20 veterans made the journey, men now in their 70s, bodies marked by age and old wounds, but minds still sharp with memories of January 1945. They walked the ground they had assaulted 5 decades earlier, the fields now peaceful farmland, the village rebuilt and prosperous. Belgian civilians and their children and grandchildren gathered to thank these elderly Americans for liberation, but the veterans' faces showed complex emotions that gratitude alone couldn't address. They remembered friends who never came home, remembered fear and cold and the specific terror of running across open ground while machine guns fired. 50 years had passed, but the weight of those memories remained. William Garnier, who lost his right leg in an artillery blast outside Foy, stood at the spot where the shell had landed. He walked with a prosthetic now, had lived 50 years with a disability earned in 3 seconds of random explosive violence. This is where it happened, he told younger relatives who had accompanied him. Joe Toy and I were sitting here, and then we weren't. His voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone who had told this story many times, who had processed the loss as much as processing was possible. But his eyes were distant, looking at a landscape that existed only in memory, snow and smoke, and the immediate aftermath when medics worked frantically to save them both. The farmland around him showed no evidence of that violence. The earth had healed, even if the men hadn't entirely. Modern tourists visiting Foy, because of Band of Brothers' popularity after its 2001 broadcast, walked the route with reverence and incomplete understanding. They could see the physical distance, 400 meters from tree line to village, but couldn't experience the psychological distance of crossing that space while being shot at. Tour guides explained tactics, pointed out German defensive positions, described the battle's sequence, but the gap between description and experience remained absolute. You can't really understand, one veteran told a tour group. I don't mean that as criticism. You just can't know what it was like unless you were there. And I wouldn't wish that knowledge on anyone. The memorial in Foy's central square had expanded over decades to include names of American soldiers killed in the battle alongside Belgian civilians who died. Ceremonies held there each January 13th brought together aging veterans, Belgian officials, American diplomatic representatives, and local school children who laid flowers without fully comprehending the events they commemorated. The rituals of remembrance served important functions, honoring sacrifice, maintaining connection between liberators and liberated, ensuring younger generations learned their history. But rituals also created distance, transforming lived trauma into official memory, personal loss into public ceremony. Veterans participated because participation honored absent friends, but they sometimes felt the ceremonies missed something essential about the messy, terrifying reality of combat. By 2005, for the 60th anniversary commemoration, only a handful of Easy Company veterans who fought at Foy remained alive. The passage of time had done what German bullets couldn't, claim nearly all the men who had survived the battle. Edward Heffron attended, now in his 80s, moving slowly but still engaged. He spoke to students from American and Belgian schools about his experiences, trying to convey truths about combat that textbooks couldn't capture. War isn't about big things, he told them. It's about small things, how cold you are, how hungry, how scared. And it's about your friends, trying to keep them alive, trying to survive together. That's what I remember most. Not the tactics or the strategic objectives, but the guys I was with. The 2015 commemoration, marking 70 years, drew international attention because everyone understood it might be the last major anniversary with living veterans present. Perhaps 2 or 3 Easy Company men who fought at Foy were still alive by then, all over 90 years old, most too frail to travel. Their absence made the ceremonies more poignant. Soon there would be no living connection to the events, no one who could speak from direct experience. The transition from living memory to history was happening in real time. Younger generations would maintain the memory through documents and recordings and rituals, but something irreplaceable was being lost: the ability to ask questions and receive answers from someone who was actually there. Historical consensus about Foy's significance evolved over 70 years from event to interpretation. Military historians agreed the battle was tactically necessary, the village controlled roads American forces needed. German observers made those roads unusable, therefore the village had to be taken. But strategically, Foy was minor, one small battle among thousands, its outcome affecting larger operations only marginally. The human cost: 42 American casualties, approximately 75 German casualties, 8 Belgian civilian deaths, was significant to those individuals and families, but numerically small compared to total war losses. What made Foy historically important wasn't its strategic impact, but its representative quality. It exemplified the brutal mathematics of infantry combat, the cost of taking defended positions, the role of leadership and courage and random chance in determining who lived and who died. The question of whether Foy's cost was justified remained unanswerable in any objective sense. Military organization said yes, the objective was secured, the strategic purpose served, the casualties acceptable within operational parameters. Veterans gave varied answers depending on personal experience and philosophy. Some found meaning in sacrifice, believing their friends died for important cause, and that giving their lives meaning required maintaining that belief. Others struggled with cynicism, questioning whether any objective justified the specific deaths of specific friends. Most held both views simultaneously, acknowledging necessity while mourning loss, accepting that war required sacrifice while wishing their friends hadn't been the ones sacrificed. Winter Dawn over Foy in 2025, exactly 80 years after the battle, arrived with the same cold clarity as January 1945. The same fields stretched toward the same village, the buildings different but occupying the same ground. No one who fought there remained alive. The last Easy Company veteran who had been at Foy died in 2022, closing the door on living memory. What remained was recorded memory documents, photographs, oral histories, videos of interviews conducted decades earlier. Future generations would know the battle only through these mediated sources, would study it in academic contexts or encounter it through popular history, would visit memorials without having met anyone who was actually there. The transformation of Foy from tactical objective to sacred ground happened gradually, veterans and civilians both ascribing meaning that transcended military calculation. It became a place where courage was demonstrated, where sacrifice was offered, where ordinary men did extraordinary things, and some never came home. The battlefield preservation and memorialization created permanent reminder that freedom's cost is sometimes paid in specific places by specific people whose names deserve remembering. But preservation also created a version of Foy that was cleaner than reality, heroic rather than chaotic, purposeful rather than confused, meaningful rather than random. The memorial version honored the dead but couldn't fully capture their experience. In the end, Foy's meaning resided less in strategic assessments or tactical analyses than in specific human moments that couldn't be reduced to military reporting. It resided in Edward Heffron finding his friend's body in the snow and sitting beside him in silence, in Eugene Rowe treating wounded soldiers with dwindling supplies and impossible choices, in Ronald Spears running through machine gun fire because leadership required it, in William Guarneret losing his legs and spending 50 years learning to walk again, in Marie Hallez hiding in a cellar while her village was destroyed above her, in 18 American soldiers dying in fields far from home for reasons that were simultaneously critical and arbitrary. These moments, multiplied across thousands of battles involving millions of soldiers, constituted the actual experience of war that generalizations and strategic analyses could never adequately capture. The final measure of Foy of any battle wasn't whether the tactics were sound or the strategy successful, but whether the survivors could live with what they had done and experienced. Most veterans found ways to integrate their combat experiences into lives that also included work, family, community, joy. They weren't defined solely by one winter day in Belgium, but neither could they entirely escape it. Foy remained part of them, surfacing in unexpected moments, when winter came and snow fell, when anniversaries arrived and memories intensified, when younger people asked questions about the war and required answers that were simultaneously honest and bearable. They had done what their country asked, had taken the village and held it, had survived when others hadn't. They lived the rest of their lives carrying that weight, not as burden entirely, but not as simple pride either. Just as weight, acknowledged and borne, the cost of having been there when history required ordinary men to do things they never imagined they'd be asked to do and never forgot having done.